There's a particular kind of silence that settles over the Scottish Highlands just before dawn. It's not the absence of sound exactly. It's more like the land is holding its breath. The wind drops, the lochs go still. Even the birds seem to pause for a moment before the first light bleeds over the eastern ridges. And if you've ever stood out there in that stillness, just you and the heather and the granite and the dark water, you might have felt something that's hard to put into words. A sense that you're not quite alone. A sense that the ground beneath your feet remembers something you don't. People have been feeling that in the Highlands for as long as people have been walking there. The local farmers, the shepherds, the hikers who stumble onto formations of standing stones half buried in peat and come back to the village with a strange look in their eyes. They all describe the same thing, a feeling, a presence, something old and patient pressing up from beneath the earth. For most of recorded history, we've written that feeling off as atmosphere. The Highlands are dramatic after all. The landscape does things to you. The low clouds, the vast emptiness, the way the light changes every few minutes. It's easy to feel things out there that might just be your own mind playing tricks. But what if it isn't? What if beneath those peat bogs and those grey slopes, beneath the bracken and the standing water and the deep cold soil, there is something real, something physical, something built by human hands so long ago that we don't have a category for it yet, something that predates Stonehenge not by centuries but by millennia, something that was already ancient when the first Egyptians were learning to write. What if the Scottish Highlands are not just a beautiful landscape, but a sealed archive? A place where the earth itself has preserved evidence of a civilization so old and so sophisticated that accepting it would require us to rewrite almost everything. We think we know about the story of humanity in Northern Europe. That's what this is about tonight. Not legend, not folklore, though there's plenty of both and we'll get to them, but the evidence. The actual physical record that has been accumulating quietly in journals and excavation reports and geophysical surveys for the better part of 2 centuries. Evidence that keeps pointing in the same direction, towards something beneath the Highlands that we are only just beginning to understand. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know. Where are you right now and what time is it? Let's start with what we know, or rather, let's start with what we thought we knew. Because the story of how our understanding of prehistoric Scotland has changed in just the last 30 years is itself one of the most remarkable intellectual journeys in modern archaeology. For most of the 20th century, the dominant narrative went something like this. Britain was populated in waves. Hunter-gatherers arrived after the last ice age, slowly moving north as the glaciers retreated. Then, around 6,000 years ago, Neolithic farmers arrived from continental Europe, bringing with them the knowledge of agriculture, the practice of building in stone, and the ritual traditions that eventually produced the great megalithic monuments we still see today. These people were sophisticated, yes, but they were also, in a sense, starting from scratch. Britain was a relatively empty place when they arrived, a clean slate. That narrative felt comfortable. It put everything in its proper place. The hunter-gatherers were the prelude. The Neolithic farmers were the beginning of the real story. And everything that came after, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Romans, the Saxons, the Norse, was just the long march toward the civilization we recognize today. The problem is that the evidence has never quite fit that narrative, not in Scotland especially. Scotland has always been the awkward part of the British Isles when it comes to prehistory. It's too far north, too cold, too difficult for the standard models to account for properly. The textbooks tend to treat it as a peripheral region where things arrived later and developed more slowly, a kind of outlier. But outliers are often where the truth is hiding. The first thing that started unraveling the standard narrative was the sheer density of prehistoric structures in Scotland. Not just standing stones, though there are thousands of those. We're talking about stone circles, chambered cairns, hill forts, burnt mounds, souterrains, crannogs, cursus monuments, henges, alignments, passage tombs, field systems, settlements. Scotland has more prehistoric structures per square mile than almost anywhere else in the British Isles, and a disproportionate number of them are old. much older than the standard narrative predicted they should be. Callanish on the Isle of Lewis is perhaps the most famous example. When it was first properly surveyed in the 19th century, estimates put its construction at roughly the same period as Stonehenge, around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. That seemed reasonable, it fit the model, but as dating techniques improved, those estimates kept getting pushed back. Today, the consensus among archaeologists who've worked the site is that the earliest phases of Callanish predate Stonehenge by at least 1,000 years. Some of the evidence suggests even older activity at the site. We're looking at a monument complex that was already a place of pilgrimage and ritual when Stonehenge was still an open field. But Callanish is just the beginning, because once you start looking at the Highlands proper, the mainland interior, the story gets stranger and considerably harder to explain. The peat bogs of the central and northern Highlands are, in a very real sense, time capsules. Peat preserves. It preserves wood. It preserves fabric. It preserves human bodies with such fidelity that you can still see the expression on their faces. And it preserves structures. Stone arrangements and wooden platforms and earthworks that would have decayed and vanished anywhere else have survived under the peat, simply because the anaerobic acidic conditions of a waterlogged bog create an environment where organic material doesn't rot. When drainage schemes were introduced across the Highlands in the 18th and 19th centuries, farmers cutting new drainage channels kept reporting strange discoveries. Stone walls at depths that didn't make sense. Wooden platforms preserved in the peat that were clearly worked timber. Clearly human construction, but so deep and so old that the farmers who found them didn't know what to make of them. Most of these discoveries were never formally recorded. They were noted in farm journals, in letters, in the minutes of local improvement societies, and then they were forgotten. The drainage work continued, the fields were planted, and whatever had been beneath the bog was either removed, reburied, or simply lost. But enough of these discoveries were recorded, and when you compile them, when you start mapping the locations and the depths and the descriptions, a pattern begins to emerge that doesn't fit any of the standard models. There are structures under the Highland peat that are not supposed to be there. They are in the wrong places, at the wrong depths, and they appear to represent a degree of organisation and permanence that the hunter-gatherers who supposedly occupied Scotland at that period were not supposed to be capable of. Let me be specific about what I mean, because this matters. The orthodox view of Mesolithic Scotland, the period before the arrival of Neolithic farming, is that it was occupied by small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers. These people were intelligent and resourceful. They knew their landscape intimately. They moved seasonally, following game and fish, setting up temporary camps, and then moving on. They left traces behind, middens full of shellfish and animal bone, flint scatters where they knapped tools, occasional post holes where their shelters stood. But they didn't build in stone. They didn't construct permanent settlements. They didn't modify the landscape on any significant scale. That's the model, and there's a great deal of evidence for it, but there's also evidence that doesn't fit. And that evidence has been quietly accumulating in the margins of the archaeological literature for decades. In 1976, a survey team working in Sutherland in the far north of Scotland reported finding what appeared to be the remains of a substantial stone structure beneath roughly 4 meters of peat. The structure was elongated, with what looked like aligned stones forming walls or chambers. The team's initial assessment was that it was probably a natural formation, glacially deposited stones that happened to resemble worked construction. The survey moved on. The site was not excavated. In 1989, a different team working a few miles away made a similar discovery. This time, the stones were clearly worked. Some of them showed the kind of deliberate dressing that you associate with construction, not natural deposition. The depth of the peat covering them put the structure's age at somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years, which placed it firmly in the Mesolithic period, when people were not supposed to be building permanent stone structures in Scotland. The team's report was published in a regional archaeological journal with a cautious summary that described the find as anomalous and recommended further investigation. That further investigation never happened. Funding wasn't available. The site was remote. And the implications of the discovery were, frankly, uncomfortable enough that no one rushed to pursue them. This is a pattern you encounter again and again in the archaeology of the Scottish Highlands. Discovery, report, cautious language, recommendation for further study. And then, silence. The site gets folded into a database somewhere, a note is made, and the world moves on. Part of this is simply the reality of how archaeology works. It's expensive, it's slow. There are always more sites than there are resources to investigate them. And genuinely anomalous sites, sites that don't fit the existing models, often struggle to attract funding precisely because the questions they raise are difficult and the answers might be inconvenient. But part of it is something else, a kind of institutional reluctance to look too hard at evidence that might require dismantling frameworks that have taken generations to build. The history of prehistoric Scotland is in some ways a story of how we have consistently underestimated the people who lived there. And each time we revise our estimates upward, each time we acknowledge that they were more sophisticated and more organized than we thought, we have to ask ourselves why we got it wrong. What were we missing? What were we not looking for? The answer, increasingly, seems to be this. We weren't looking down. The geophysical surveys that have been conducted across parts of the Highlands in recent decades have produced results that continue to surprise the people running them. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, electrical resistivity surveys, all the tools that modern archaeologists use to see beneath the surface without having to excavate, have been mapping anomalies across the Highland landscape that don't match what should be there. There are linear features running for kilometers beneath the peat that look like boundaries or pathways. There are circular anomalies, sometimes dozens of them clustered together, that match the signature of structures rather than natural formations. There are what appear to be massive earthworks, banks and ditches of a scale that would have required organized labor on a significant scale, buried under several meters of accumulated peat and soil. None of this has been fully excavated. None of it has been definitively identified. But the surveys keep coming back with the same kinds of readings in locations spread across the central and northern Highlands, and the people running those surveys keep writing the same cautious words in their reports. Anomalies of uncertain origin, further investigation required, potential evidence of significant prehistoric activity. What they're dancing around, what the careful academic language is trying not to say too directly, is that the Scottish Highlands may contain the remains of a civilization substantially older and more organized than anything currently recognized in the standard account of British prehistory. And if that's true, then the question isn't just, what was it? The question is, what happened to it? Because whatever was here is gone now, or rather, it's hidden, sealed under the peat and the soil and the slow accumulation of centuries. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating and underexplored questions in British archaeology. How did all that peat get there in the first place? The formation of the Highland peat bogs is conventionally explained as a natural process. As the climate cooled and became wetter after the end of the last ice age, the conditions became favorable for the growth of sphagnum moss and other bog plants. Over thousands of years, these plants accumulated faster than they decayed, building up layers of peat that eventually covered much of the Highland landscape to depths of several meters. That's true as far as it goes, but there's a complicating factor that is not always emphasized in the popular accounts. The formation of the Highland bogs was accelerated by human activity, specifically by large-scale forest clearance. When the first Neolithic farmers arrived in Scotland, they found a landscape that was substantially more forested than it is today. The Highlands were covered, in large parts, by the Caledonian forest. Great stands of Scots, pine, birch, oak, and hazel covering the slopes and valleys. This forest played a crucial role in regulating water in the soil. The trees absorbed rainfall, released it slowly, and their root systems helped maintain the structure of the soil itself. When farmers cleared that forest to create fields and pasture, they broke that system. Without tree cover, rainfall couldn't be absorbed efficiently. The soil became waterlogged. The conditions that allow peat to form were created, and the peat began to grow, covering the cleared land, sealing beneath it whatever had been there before. Now here's where it gets interesting. because the archaeology of forest clearance in Scotland doesn't fit a single neat timeline. In some parts of the Highlands, the evidence suggests large-scale clearance happened earlier than the standard Neolithic arrival date. There are pollen records from certain Highland bogs that show sudden dramatic reductions in tree pollen at depths that correspond to dates well before 6,000 years ago, before the supposed arrival of farming. There are a few ways to interpret this. One is that there were people in the Highlands before the Neolithic farmers arrived who were already modifying the landscape on a significant scale. Hunter-gatherers who were, for whatever reason, clearing forest, perhaps to create better hunting grounds, perhaps to manage the landscape in more deliberate ways than the standard model allows for, or perhaps because they were doing something else entirely, something we don't have a good category for yet. The other possibility, the one that makes some researchers genuinely uncomfortable, is that the timeline is wrong, that people with agricultural knowledge and the capacity for organized landscape modification were in the Scottish Highlands earlier than the current models say they were, which would push back the date of a settled, organized human presence in Scotland by potentially thousands of years. Neither interpretation is neat, neither fits cleanly into the existing framework. But the pollen evidence is real, and it keeps coming up in studies of different Highland bogs in different parts of the region, from research groups that have no particular axe to grind. Something was happening in the Highlands before we thought people were doing much of anything there, and whatever it was happening on a large enough scale to leave a chemical signature in the bog sediments that we can still detect today. Let's talk about the structures that have actually been excavated, because while most of the subsurface evidence in the Highlands remains unexcavated, there are enough sites that have been properly dug to give us some sense of what we might be dealing with. The chambered cairns of Scotland are among the oldest surviving structures anywhere in the British Isles. These are megalithic tombs, stone chambers covered by cairns of smaller stones, used for the burial of the dead over long periods. They're found across Scotland, but the density is particularly high in certain parts of the Highlands and Islands. The most famous is perhaps Maeshowe in Orkney, which dates to around 5,000 years ago and is rightly celebrated as one of the finest examples of Neolithic architecture anywhere in Europe. But Maeshowe is not exceptional in terms of its age. There are chambered cairns on the Scottish mainland that are just as old, and some that appear to be older. The Campster cairns in Caithness, for example, have been dated to between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. The grey cairns of Campster are among the best preserved Neolithic monuments in Scotland, and when archaeologists excavated them in the 19th century, they found evidence of use spanning thousands of years. These weren't just built once, they were returned to again and again. They were maintained, modified, expanded, which means the community that used them had a continuous presence in the area over an enormous span of time. But even these well-known sites, as remarkable as they are not what we're really talking about when we talk about something sealed beneath the Scottish Highlands. The chambered cairns are known, they're mapped, they're studied, they're part of the official narrative. What we're talking about is what's beneath the cairns, and beneath the bogs that surround them, and beneath the slopes and valleys and moorland that makes up the vast majority of the Highland landscape that has never been systematically surveyed. There's a site in the far northwest of Scotland, in Sutherland, that illustrates this perfectly. I'm not going to give you the exact location because the site is currently under review and the archaeologists working on it are understandably protective of it. But the broad outlines have been discussed in conference presentations and in at least one published abstract, so I'm not revealing anything confidential here. What the survey team found, using a combination of aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar, was a complex of structures beneath the peat that extends over several square kilometers. The complex includes what appear to be circular enclosures of considerable size, linear features that may be field boundaries or pathways, and a series of larger anomalies that the survey team has tentatively identified as possible building platforms. The peat covering the complex averages around 3 meters in depth. The dating of the peat at the base of the deposit, which gives a rough date for when the surface was last exposed and active, suggests that the landscape was sealed sometime between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, which means whatever is beneath it was built before that, before the peat sealed it, before whoever built it was gone. The survey team estimates that the complex could represent several thousand years of continuous occupation and construction. They describe it, in the abstract, as potentially the largest unexcavated prehistoric site in Scotland. They note that excavation would be extraordinarily expensive and technically challenging. They recommend further non-invasive survey work. And they note that the implications of the site, if confirmed by excavation, would be significant for our understanding of the prehistoric occupation of northwest Scotland. That's the academic version. The unacademic version is that they found something enormous under the bog that nobody knew was there, and they don't quite know what to do with it. And this is not an isolated case. In Wester Ross, in Inverness Shire, in Ross and Cromarty, in Caithness, similar patterns keep turning up. Not always as large, not always as clearly defined, but consistently pointing in the same direction. The Highland landscape conceals far more than the surface suggests. Now, you might be wondering why, if all this evidence exists, it isn't better known. Why isn't it front-page news? Why aren't there documentaries and press releases and breathless announcements about the lost civilization of the Scottish Highlands? Part of the answer is institutional inertia. Archaeology as a discipline is genuinely conservative, and that conservatism serves important purposes. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence for what lies beneath the Highland peat, while compelling, is not yet at the level of extraordinary. It's suggestive, it's intriguing, it points toward something significant. But until major excavations are undertaken and the findings properly published and peer-reviewed, it remains in the category of potential rather than confirmed. Part of the answer is funding. Excavating a site buried under 3 meters of peat in a remote part of the Scottish Highlands, with limited road access and an unpredictable weather, is extremely expensive. The kind of excavation that would be needed to properly investigate these sites would require millions of pounds and years of work. That money doesn't come easily, especially for sites that are described in grant applications as anomalous and inconsistent with current models. Funding bodies tend to prefer projects whose findings can be predicted in advance, which is a peculiar situation when you think about it, since the whole point of research is to discover things you didn't already know. And part of the answer is that the story is genuinely difficult to communicate. Unlike a Roman temple or a Viking longship, the buried landscape of the Scottish Highlands doesn't resolve into simple, dramatic images. It resolves into data, survey maps, radar profiles, pollen diagrams, statistical analyses of bone assemblages. It takes expertise to read this data, and it takes patience to explain why it matters. But it matters. It matters enormously, because what we're potentially looking at is evidence of a deep human history in the Scottish Highlands that fundamentally challenges the narrative we've been telling about the peopling of Britain. The standard story puts Scotland at the edge of the story, a peripheral region where civilization arrived late and developed slowly, a place where things happened after they happened everywhere else. But the evidence from beneath the Highland peat suggests a different story. A story where the northern tip of Britain was not an afterthought, but a centre, where people were building, organising, clearing, constructing, and creating on a significant scale, thousands of years before the textbooks say they were. And here's the thing that makes this genuinely mysterious, rather than just archaeologically interesting. We don't know why it ended, because something did end. Whatever was happening in the Highlands before the peat sealed it, whatever civilization or proto-civilization or organized community had built those structures and maintained those landscapes, it was gone. Or rather, it had changed so completely that the evidence of what it had been was buried and forgotten. By the time the first written accounts of Scotland appear, several thousand years later, there is no memory of what lies beneath the bog, no legend that accurately describes what the buried structures were, no tradition that preserves the knowledge of who built them or why. Or is there? This is where the folklore becomes interesting, because Scotland has an extraordinarily rich tradition of stories about the land itself, about places of power and places of danger, about structures that predate memory, about things built by beings who were not quite human, or were human in ways that no longer exist. The fairy mounds, the Scythian in Gaelic, are perhaps the most widespread of these traditions. Across the Highlands and Islands, certain hills and mounds are said to be hollow, to contain within them a world that runs parallel to ours, but is older and stranger. The beings who live in these places are not the cute fairy tale fairies of Victorian imagination. They are dangerous, unpredictable, deeply powerful. They have their own society, their own laws, their own relationship to time that is completely unlike ours. Time runs differently in the Scythian. A night spent inside can be a century outside. An hour in the other world can mean waking to find everyone you knew is dead. Archaeologists have long noted that many of the locations traditionally associated with fairy mounds are, in fact, Neolithic or Bronze Age burial mounds. The Scythian are real places with real prehistoric structures inside them. The tradition of their being hollow, of them containing another world, may be a folk memory of the fact that they literally do contain chambers, passage tombs and gallery graves that prehistoric people entered for ritual purposes, that later generations encountered but didn't understand, and that acquired over centuries a supernatural significance precisely because they were mysterious and old and felt different from the ordinary landscape. But the fairy mound tradition is much more widespread than just the mapped and known prehistoric structures. There are Scythian all over the Highland landscape that don't correspond to any known archaeological site. Hills and mounds and ridges that local tradition insists are hollow, that are avoided or treated with caution, that feature in stories of strange encounters and altered time. And some of these locations correspond, when you overlay them with the geophysical survey data, to the anomalies under the peat. Not all of them, not even most of them. The correspondence is not perfect enough to draw any firm conclusions, but the pattern is there. The places that local tradition has always treated as special, as different, as containing something that ordinary places don't, often turn out to be places where there is something underground, something that the surveys detect but that no one has yet excavated. The Gaelic tradition also contains references to a people called the Firbolg and the Tuatha De Danann and other pre-Celtic inhabitants of the British Isles. These traditions are primarily preserved in Irish sources, but they have Scottish counterparts, and they describe successive waves of people arriving in the British Isles, each displacing or absorbing the previous inhabitants, with the oldest and most mysterious of these earlier peoples disappearing underground or into the Western Sea or into some other realm that is present but inaccessible. Scholars have typically read these traditions as mythology, as stories that various cultures told to make sense of the ruins they found around them, the evidence of peoples who had come before and disappeared without any real historical content. But there's a growing body of opinion that at least some of these traditions preserve genuine historical memory of events that happened in the deep past. That the Tuatha De Danann and their analogues in Scottish tradition are not pure invention, but are, at some remove, reflections of real people and real cultural encounters that took place thousands of years ago. What happened to them in the story's mirrors, what the archaeology suggests happened in reality. They were here, they built, they organized, and then they were gone, or transformed, or absorbed, or sealed beneath the earth along with the evidence of their existence. There's a Scottish tradition that I find particularly compelling in this context. It concerns the area around Loch Ness, which everyone knows for the wrong reasons. But before the monster stories, before the tourist infrastructure and the sonar surveys, there was a much older tradition associated with the Loch and the valley it sits in, the Great Glen. The Great Glen is a geological fault line that runs diagonally across Scotland from southwest to northeast, from Fort William to Inverness. It's one of the most striking landscape features in Britain, a dead straight valley cutting right through the Highland Massif. The Loch, Loch Ness, Loch Oich, and Loch Lochy fill the bottom of the valley, linked by the Caledonian Canal in more recent times, and the valley has been a route through the Highlands since prehistory, a natural corridor connecting the east and west coasts. The tradition I'm thinking of concerns what lies beneath Loch Ness specifically, not the monster, something older than the monster stories. There is a body of folklore, primarily collected in the 19th century from Gaelic-speaking communities around the Loch, that describes the Loch as being built, not naturally formed but artificially made. The tradition holds that the valley was dammed, or that the Loch was in some sense constructed, by beings or people who lived before the current order of the world. It describes the Loch as covering something, as being a lid on something rather than a natural feature of the landscape. Geologically, the Loch is a natural feature. The Great Glen Fault created the valley, and the Loch formed as the valley filled with water after the last ice age. There's no geological basis for the idea that it was artificially made. But here's what's interesting. The floor of Loch Ness has never been comprehensively surveyed. It's extremely deep, over 200 meters in the deepest parts. The water is so dark with peat particles that visibility is effectively zero below a few meters. What sonar surveys have been done have focused, inevitably, on looking for large, unidentified organisms rather than archaeological features, and the few surveys that have looked at the Loch floor for other reasons have found, in certain areas, features that their operators have described as anomalous without being able to say what they are. The tradition that something is sealed beneath the Loch, or sealed in the valley beneath the Loch, might be a distorted folk memory of the fact that the Great Glen has been a centre of human activity for a very long time, and that the landscape of the valley conceals evidence of that activity under its waters and under its peat. But I want to be careful here. I don't want to overreach. The Loch Ness tradition is suggestive, but it's folklore, and folklore is not evidence. What it is, though, is a reminder that the people who lived in these landscapes for thousands of years were paying attention to things that we've largely stopped paying attention to. They noticed what was strange about certain places. They marked those places in their stories. And sometimes, when you go back to those places with modern equipment, you find that there was a reason. They were strange. Let's shift now to something more concrete. The question of what, specifically, might have been built in the Scottish Highlands in the deep past, and what evidence we have for it. The standard prehistory of Scotland identifies several periods of major monument building. The Neolithic period, from roughly 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, saw the construction of the passage, tombs and chambered cairns and the earliest stone circles. The early Bronze Age, from around 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, saw the development of the great stone circle complexes, like Callanish, and the construction of numerous cairns and standing stones. The later Bronze Age and Iron Age saw the construction of the hill forts and brocks, those extraordinary round towers unique to Scotland that are among the most impressive buildings from the prehistoric British Isles. Each of these periods is reasonably well documented, at least in outline. But what came before the Neolithic? What happened in the Mesolithic, the period of the hunter-gatherers, before farming and monument building supposedly arrived? The conventional answer is, not much. Or rather, things happened, but at a scale and of a kind that left limited archaeological traces. People moved through the landscape. They hunted, fished, gathered. They made tools. They may have had beliefs and rituals that we can't recover because they didn't build in stone or bury their dead in ways that survive in the archaeological record. But there's one site that has forced a significant revision of this picture, and it does so in a way that's relevant to the Highland evidence we've been discussing. At Stonehaven, on the northeast coast of Scotland, there's a site called Warren Field. In 2004, archaeologists excavating what they thought was a relatively recent pit alignment found something extraordinary. A series of large pits that turned out to be the post holes of a massive timber structure. And when they dated those post holes, the results came back at around 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years. That's nearly twice the age of Stonehenge. That's the Mesolithic period, when hunter-gatherers were not supposed to be building permanent structures. But Warren Field is not just old, it's sophisticated. The pits are arranged in an arc, and the arc corresponds to the positions on the horizon where the moon rises at different points in its cycle. The structure appears to have been designed to track the lunar calendar, which means that whoever built it 10,000 years ago had a detailed understanding of lunar cycles and the astronomical knowledge to encode that understanding in a permanent physical structure. That is not what hunter-gatherers are supposed to be doing. That's the kind of knowledge we associate with settled, organized communities, with people who had the time to observe the sky over years and decades, with people who had a reason to care about long-term timekeeping, with people who were planning seasons and coordinating activities over large areas. Warren Field has changed the conversation in Scottish archaeology, because if you can build a lunar calendar complex 10,000 years ago in Aberdeenshire, what might you be able to build in the Highlands, in those remote glens and high moors where no one has looked systematically, in the places where the peat is 4 meters deep and the geophysical surveys keep returning anomalies? The implications are significant, because what Warren Field suggests is not that the Mesolithic people of Scotland were anomalously sophisticated in one location. It suggests that the model itself is wrong, that the Mesolithic people of Scotland were more organized, more capable of complex construction, and more concerned with long-term tracking of time and sky than the standard narrative allows for. And if that's true in the Mesolithic, then by the time the Neolithic farmers supposedly arrived and supposedly taught the locals how to build in stone, the locals may already have been building in stone for a very long time. Let me tell you about Brú for a moment, even though it's in Ireland rather than Scotland, because it's directly relevant to what we're discussing. Newgrange, the Great Passage tomb in County Meath, dates to around 5,000 years ago. It's famous for its winter solstice alignment, where the rising sun on the solstice shines directly down the passage and illuminates the inner chamber. That alignment was deliberate. The tomb was oriented with extraordinary precision to capture the solstice sunrise. What's often not emphasized enough is how much knowledge that precision implies. To align a structure that accurately with an astronomical event, you need to have been observing that event over many years. You need to understand that the position of the solstice sunrise shifts slightly from year to year in a predictable cycle, and you need to be able to correct for that in your design. You need, in short, a tradition of astronomical observation that goes back considerably further than the monument itself. Where was that tradition being kept in the centuries and millennia before Newgrange was built? Not in permanent structures that survived, not in written records. It was being kept in memory, in the knowledge held by particular communities. Communities that were present in Ireland and Britain long before the monuments that survive. If those communities existed in Ireland, they existed in Scotland too. They may have been building structures of their own in Scotland, structures that were less permanent than Newgrange, or structures that were just as permanent but are now sealed under peat rather than exposed on a prominent river bend. The astronomical traditions preserved in the Highland landscape are extensive, even taking into account only what's currently known. Callanish, with its lunar alignments. The Campster cairns, which are oriented to the midwinter sunrise. The Ring of Brodgar in Orkney, and its relationship to the surrounding landscape, and the positions of other monuments. The recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire, a distinctive form found only in Scotland, where a large horizontal stone is placed between two tall flanking stones in a position that appears to track the movement of the moon across the horizon. The alignments of standing stones across the Highland landscape that point toward mountain summits where the sun sets on significant dates. These are not random. They represent a consistent and sophisticated tradition of astronomical observation embedded in architecture. And that tradition did not emerge suddenly. It accumulated. It was refined over generations. The people who built Callanish were working within a tradition that was already old when they started building, a tradition that must have originated in structures and observing practices that predate the monuments we know about. Some of those earlier structures must still be there, sealed under the landscape, waiting. There's something that happens when you stand inside Callanish on a clear night that I want to try to describe, because I think it gets at something important about why this matters, beyond the purely archaeological interest. The stones of Callanish rise out of a moorland that goes on forever in every direction. The island of Lewis is flat and wide, and the sky seems enormous. At night, with no light pollution, the Milky Way is visible in a way that it almost never is in the modern world. It hangs overhead like a river. The stars that the builders of Callanish were watching are still there. The alignments that they encoded in the stone still work. The moon still rises over the stone avenue in the particular way that it rises only once every 19 years, during what astronomers call the major lunar standstill, when the moon's arc across the sky is at its maximum extent, and it appears to walk along the ridge of the mountains to the south before setting into the hill that lies within the stone circle itself. In that moment, at Callanish, on a clear night during a major lunar standstill, you are watching the same thing that people were watching when they built the stones. You are seeing what they saw, and you understand, at a level that bypasses rational explanation, that this was important to them in a way that goes beyond any practical function. They weren't just tracking the moon for agricultural purposes. They were doing something that we would recognize, if we're honest with ourselves, as religious. They were in relationship with the sky. They were participating in something they felt themselves to be part of, something enormous and old and not entirely comprehensible. And they built a structure to hold that relationship, to anchor it in stone so that it would persist, so that it could be returned to, generation after generation, by people who might not have the full understanding that the original builders had, but who could still participate in the relationship, who could still stand in the right place at the right time and see what the sky was doing. That impulse to preserve and transmit something too important to be left to memory alone is the impulse behind every great monument. And if that impulse was operating at Callanish 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, it was operating in the Highlands long before that. It was operating in Warrenfield 10,000 years ago. And it was almost certainly operating in places and at times that we haven't discovered yet. The Highland landscape is full of standing stones that haven't been properly studied, full of stone circles that haven't been dated, full of alignments and cairns and enclosures that appear on surveys and are noted and move on to the next one, because there isn't time and funding to investigate every potential site. Some percentage of those unstudied sites are older than we think. Some percentage of them are part of a tradition that stretches back into the Mesolithic, into the deep past, into the period before the standard narrative says people were doing this kind of thing. And some percentage of what's been found and noted and deferred for further investigation contains the key to a genuinely different understanding of who the prehistoric people of the Scottish Highlands were, what they were capable of, what they built, and what happened to them, because something did happen. The landscape of the Highland peat bogs is, in a very real sense, a catastrophe preserved. The peat didn't form gradually and gently over thousands of years. In many areas, the peat formation was rapid. There are pollen records that show sudden transitions, within decades rather than centuries, from a diverse woodland landscape with evidence of human habitation and activity, to a wet, treeless, increasingly boggy environment with a sharp reduction in evidence of human presence. These rapid transitions happen in multiple locations at different times, which suggests they weren't caused by a single catastrophic event. They seem instead to reflect a process of landscape degradation that happened in waves. Clearance led to waterlogging, waterlogging led to bog formation made the land uninhabitable, or at least unsuitable for the kinds of activities that had been taking place. And the people who had been living there moved, or adapted, or disappeared. The structures that remained were sealed, the stones were covered, the earthworks were buried, and the memory of what had been there faded, generation by generation, into legend, into the hollow hills, into the stories of the Tuatha De Danann descending underground, into the fairy mounds and the warning not to disturb them. But here's what I keep coming back to. What the geophysical surveys are finding is that the structures are still there. Sealed, yes. Buried, yes. Under meters of peat and centuries of silence. But still there. Coherent. Preserved by the same peat that buried them. The archaeology is there to be done. The technology to do it non-invasively already exists and is improving all the time. The evidence from the surveys that have been conducted is compelling enough to justify proper excavation. What's missing is the commitment, the funding, the institutional will to take the risk of finding something that doesn't fit. I think that will is growing, slowly, but it's growing. The Warrenfield discovery changed things. The reanalysis of the Callanish dating changed things. The increasingly sophisticated geophysical surveys being conducted across the Highlands are changing things. Each discovery revises the model upward. Each new finding makes the possibility of genuinely ancient organized civilization in the Highlands a little less extraordinary and a little more plausible. And eventually, I think, the excavation will happen. Someone will get the funding and the access and the weather window and the team, and they will put a trench into one of those highland bogs, and they will find what the surveys have been pointing to. And on that day, the story of prehistoric Britain will change. Not dramatically, not overnight. Academic change is slow, but it will change. The textbooks will be revised, the narratives will be updated, and whatever lies sealed beneath the Scottish Highlands will finally be brought back into the light. But before we get to what might be found, I want to spend some time on another angle of this story that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Because we've been focusing on the physical evidence, the structures, and the surveys, and the peat, and the pollen. But there's a parallel story that runs alongside the physical one, a story about language, about names, about the way that places carry their history in the sounds people use to describe them. The place names of Scotland are extraordinarily complex and layered. The most recent layer is largely English, dating from the last few centuries. Beneath that is a layer of Scots, the lowland Germanic language that displaced Gaelic in much of southern Scotland. Beneath that is Gaelic, which was spoken across most of Scotland for well over 1,000 years. And beneath Gaelic is a layer of names whose origins are obscure even to linguists. Names that don't resolve neatly into any known language, that appear to predate Gaelic, that survive in certain places where the Gaelic speakers, who came after, could not or chose not to replace them. These pre-Gaelic names are particularly concentrated in the Highlands, in the far north and west especially. Linguists call this the P-Celtic substrate, or, more controversially, the Pictish substrate, associating these names with the Picts. The people who occupied Scotland before the Gaelic-speaking Scots arrived from Ireland in the early medieval period. But the Pictish language itself is poorly understood, and some researchers have argued that at least some of the anomalous Highland place names are not Pictish, but something even older. A language, or languages, that predate even the Picts. This is extremely difficult to prove, because you can't date a place name the way you can date a piece of pottery. But the argument goes like this. If a name survives through multiple language replacements, if it's still being used in more or less the same form after Pictish and then Gaelic and then English have all washed over it, that suggests the name is attached to something that people kept referring to, regardless of what language they were speaking. And what keeps a name alive when languages change is usually physical significance. A feature of the landscape that's too important or too prominent or too strange to be renamed. The rivers of Scotland are a particularly interesting case. Many Highland river names appear to be extremely old, possibly pre-Celtic. Names like the Spee and the Nith and the Dee and the Don appear in forms in Roman sources that are recognizable, roughly, from the names still used today, but their etymologies don't resolve neatly into Celtic roots. They seem to belong to a different layer of language, a layer that was already there when the first Celtic speakers arrived in Britain. What does this have to do with what lies beneath the Highland peat? It's a form of evidence. It's another data point in the same direction. The place names suggest that the landscape of the Highlands was meaningful to people for a very long time, that it was understood and described and remembered in language that predates anything we have a record of, that there was a continuous human presence in the Highlands, naming and mapping and knowing this landscape for much longer than the standard models suggest. The river names specifically are interesting because rivers are where people live. People settle near water. People build near water. The rivers of the Highlands were the corridors along which prehistoric communities moved and lived and built. If the names of those rivers are pre-Celtic, older than the Celts, then there were people living along those rivers, naming them, using them, long before the Celtic period began. And some of what those people built might still be there, under the peat. Now, I want to bring in a dimension of this story that takes us across the Atlantic, because one of the most fascinating and underappreciated aspects of the mystery of the ancient Scottish Highlands is its potential connection to what happened on the other side of the ocean, in the place we now call North America. This is where the forbidden history aspect of our topic becomes really interesting, because there is a body of evidence contested, incomplete, sometimes badly handled, but real evidence that people from the British Isles, specifically from the Atlantic fringe of Britain, including Scotland, were making transatlantic crossings long before Columbus, long before the Vikings, potentially long before anyone in the mainstream history accepts. Let me be clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that Neolithic Scots colonized the Americas. I'm not saying that the Maya, or the Aztecs, or the mound builders of North America were descended from Scottish Highlanders. The evidence does not support that kind of grand claim. What I am saying is that there is growing evidence that the North Atlantic was crossable in small boats earlier than we think, that there were people in the British Isles with the maritime technology and the navigational knowledge to attempt such crossings, and that the cultural and genetic connections between Atlantic fringe populations on both sides of the ocean are more complex and more ancient than the standard models of pre-Columbian contact acknowledge. The case for this starts with the boats. The skin boats of the British Isles, the hide-covered wooden-framed vessels that were in use across the Atlantic seaboard, from Ireland and Scotland through the Hebrides, are among the most seaworthy small craft ever developed. The currach of Ireland and the similar vessels of the Scottish Atlantic coast are capable of making long ocean passages in ways that most people find surprising. Tim Severin demonstrated this definitively in 1976 when he sailed a replica 6th century Irish curragh from Ireland to Newfoundland, following the route described in the medieval account of St. Brendan's voyage. The journey took 14 months, but it was completed successfully. Brendan's voyage is usually treated as a religious legend, but the descriptions in it of landscapes encountered along the way, including descriptions of volcanoes and icebergs and flat-topped mountains rising from the sea, correspond accurately to the geography of the North Atlantic. Iceland, the Faroe Islands, possibly Greenland or the coast of North America. These descriptions appear to preserve real geographic knowledge of the North Atlantic that could only have been acquired by actual voyagers. The question is when. The Brendan voyage tradition is medieval, 6th century at the earliest in its recorded form. But the maritime technology it describes is much older than the medieval period. The currach is not a medieval invention. It's a technology with a very long history in the Atlantic fringe communities of Britain and Ireland. And the navigational knowledge that makes an ocean passage possible accumulates over generations, over centuries. The people who sailed with Brendan, if the voyage was historical, were operating within a tradition of Atlantic seamanship that went back a very long time. How long? That's the question. And the answer, frustratingly, is that we don't know. Because the evidence for early Atlantic seafaring is largely non-existent in the archaeological record. Small boats made of wood and hide don't survive for thousands of years. Temporary camps on remote shorelines leave minimal traces. And the people who were doing this, if they were doing this, were not the kind of people who left the large archaeologically visible evidence that gets studied and published and incorporated into the standard narrative. But there are traces, genetic traces especially. The field of ancient DNA has transformed our understanding of prehistoric population movements in ways that the physical archaeology alone could never have achieved. And some of what the ancient DNA evidence is showing is genuinely unexpected. There is a genetic lineage, a particular haplogroup associated with Atlantic fringe populations in Western Britain and Ireland that shows up in unexpected places across the North Atlantic world. In the populations of Iceland, settled long before the Norse period, in certain indigenous groups in coastal eastern North America, in populations along the western coast of Greenland. The distribution of this genetic signature doesn't fit neatly into any of the known models of population movement. It appears, in the preliminary analyses that have been published, to suggest contacts across the North Atlantic that predate the accepted timeline of transatlantic contact by a considerable margin. This research is controversial. The sample sizes are small. The analyses are preliminary. Other researchers have offered alternative interpretations of the same data. The field of ancient DNA is moving so fast that conclusions drawn from papers published 5 years ago are often already being revised. I'm not presenting this as settled science. I'm presenting it as emerging evidence that points in a direction that the standard model of pre-Columbian isolation can no longer simply ignore. And here's the connection back to the Scottish Highlands. Because the Atlantic fringe communities that had this seafaring tradition, these people who were sailing the North Atlantic in skin boats and whose genetic signature appears in unexpected places around the ocean, were the same communities that built the megaliths, that oriented their monuments to astronomical events, that practiced a form of long-term landscape management and knowledge transmission that kept their traditions alive across thousands of years. The people of the Outer Hebrides, of the Scottish Atlantic coast, of the great stone-building tradition that produced Callanish and the chambered cairns of Sutherland and Caithness, were Atlantic seafarers. They had been for a very long time. The sea was not a barrier for them. It was a highway, and that highway connected them not just to Ireland and continental Europe, but potentially to everything that lay beyond the western horizon. If they were making transatlantic contacts, even irregularly, even occasionally, then what was happening in the Highlands was not isolated. It was connected to a much wider world than the textbooks acknowledge, to conversations and exchanges and influences that we have no record of, that have left traces only in the DNA of people on both sides of the ocean and in the persistent, infuriating anomalies that keep appearing in the genetic and archaeological data. There is a site in North America that I need to tell you about. It's called Lonceau Meadows in Newfoundland, and it's the only accepted archaeological evidence of a pre-Columbian Norse settlement in the Americas. The Norse were there around 1,000 years ago. That's accepted. That's in the textbooks. But Lonceau Meadows is not the most interesting site on the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. The most interesting site is a place called Red Bay, where there is evidence of pre-Norse contact with the Atlantic. And surrounding Red Bay, in the Basque and Norse sources that describe that coastline, there are references to people already present when the first recorded European visitors arrived. People who were described as having boats, who were clearly not unfamiliar with seafarers, who seemed to have had some framework for understanding encounters with people from across the ocean. Where did that framework come from? How do you develop a context for encounters with transatlantic visitors if you've never had any? The suggestion, made carefully and tentatively by several researchers in the literature, is that the indigenous communities of the northeastern Atlantic seaboard of North America had been having contact with transatlantic visitors for longer than the Norse period, that the Norse were not the first, that whoever came before them, whenever they came, left a cultural memory that made later contacts more comprehensible. Who came before the Norse? That question is not answered. It may never be fully answered. But the Atlantic fringe communities of Scotland and Ireland, with their millennia-old tradition of ocean seamanship and their sophisticated astronomical knowledge and their strange genetic signature appearing in places it shouldn't be, are the most plausible candidates. Let's go back to Scotland, because there's one more piece of this puzzle that I haven't addressed yet, and it's perhaps the most evocative and the most frustrating of all. The Picts. The Picts are the people who occupied Scotland north of the Fourth Clyde Line when the Romans arrived in Britain in the 1st century AD. They were the people the Romans described as the unconquered North, the people who drove Hadrian to build his wall, who pushed Antoninus to build another wall further north that the Romans eventually had to abandon, the people who were never Romanized, never fully assimilated, who maintained a distinct culture and a distinct identity through the Roman period and beyond. The Picts are mysterious. We have no written language from them. We have no extended texts, no chronicles, no mythology recorded in their own words. What we have are the symbol stones, remarkable carved stones, hundreds of them, found across the Pictish heartland of eastern Scotland, bearing a repertoire of symbols that appear and reappear in consistent combinations across a wide area and a long time period. The symbols are clearly meaningful. They're not random. They appear in consistent relationships with each other. They're carved with considerable artistic skill. They appear on portable objects as well as on stones. They are clearly a form of communication, a system of visual symbols that conveyed information that Pictish people understood. But we don't know what they mean. Despite centuries of study, Despite generations of researchers devoting their careers to the problem, the Pictish symbols remain undeciphered. We don't know if they're a form of writing, a heraldic system, a calendar, a set of religious symbols, a system for recording genealogy, or something else entirely. We don't know. And the reason we don't know is not just that the symbols are complex or that there aren't enough examples to work with. It's that they don't seem to derive from any known symbolic system. They're not related to the Ogham alphabet used in Ireland. They're not related to Roman letters or Greek letters or any of the other writing systems that were in use around Europe at the time. They appear to have emerged from a local tradition, a Pictish tradition, that has no clear connection to anything outside Scotland, which raises the question of where that tradition came from. The Picts didn't appear out of nowhere. They were the people of prehistoric Scotland, the descendants of the same communities that had been living in the Highlands and the East Coast Plain for thousands of years. Their symbolic system, however strange it appears in the context of the wider European world, grew out of a local tradition that was ancient when the Romans arrived. Could that tradition, the tradition that produced the Pictish symbols, have roots in something older? Something connected to the builders of the passage tombs and the stone circles? Something reaching back to the people who sealed their landscape under the peat, who built the structures that the geophysical surveys are detecting beneath the Highland moorland? We don't know. We can't know with the evidence currently available. But the Pictish symbols are there, carved into stones across Scotland, representing a tradition of visual communication that the Picts themselves eventually carried forward and eventually lost when their culture was absorbed into the Gaelic-speaking world of early medieval Scotland. And before the Picts, there were the people who left those traces in the peat, whose stones are being detected by radar surveys, whose memory filtered into legend, and whose structures are waiting, sealed to be rediscovered. The connection might be direct. The Picts might be the descendants of those earlier people, carrying forward in a changed form a tradition that was already very old. The symbol system might be the latest evolution of a form of communication that goes back much further than the carved stones suggest, or the connection might be indirect. The Picts might have inherited and adapted fragments of an older tradition that was itself already mostly lost by the time the symbol stones were being carved, a tradition preserved in certain practices and certain places and certain ways of understanding the landscape, but no longer fully understood even by the people who maintained it. Either way, the stones are there, the symbols are there, the tradition is there, and it points backward into the Highland landscape, into the deep past, into the peat and the bog and the sealed structures and the astronomical alignments and the place names that nobody can quite explain. I want to spend some time now on the physical landscape itself, because one of the things that gets lost in discussions of Scottish prehistory is just how extreme and dramatic the Highland landscape is, and what that extremity has meant for the people who lived there and for the preservation of what they left behind. The Scottish Highlands are among the oldest exposed rock surfaces in Europe. The Louisian gneiss, which underlies the Outer Hebrides and parts of the Northwest Highland mainland, is among the oldest rock on the surface of the planet anywhere. It was formed over 3 billion years ago. It is literally some of the original crust of the Earth, squeezed and folded and metamorphosed and exposed by the erosion of everything that was once above it. Standing on Louisian gneiss, you are standing on something genuinely primordial, something that predates the Himalayas and the Alps and the Rockies, something that was already ancient when the dinosaurs first walked on it. That extreme antiquity of the landscape has a psychological and cultural effect on people. It makes the land feel different. It gives it a quality that is hard to describe, but that most people who spend time in the Northwest Highlands recognize. A weight, a depth, a sense of time that doesn't operate on human scales. The people who built the monuments of the Highlands were building on and into and around rock that was billions of years old. They were marking their presence on something that had been there before life existed and would be there long after they were gone. And somehow, that seems to have mattered to them. The oldest landscapes attracted the most intensive monument building. The most sacred places were where the ancient rock was most exposed. Callanish is built on Lewisian gneiss. So are many of the other great monument complexes of the Outer Hebrides. The choice of location was not accidental. These people understood something about their landscape that we've largely forgotten. That certain places carry a quality that others don't. That the ancient rock is different from newer formations. That there is a relationship between the geology and the sacred that is worth encoding in stone. This makes the buried landscape of the Highlands all the more interesting, because if the oldest and most powerful places, the places where the rock was most ancient and the sky was clearest and the astronomical alignments were most precise, if those places attracted the most intensive use over the longest period, then the fact that they're buried under peat rather than exposed like Callanish doesn't mean they were less important. It might mean they were more important. The burial might have been intentional in some cases, a deliberate sealing of sacred landscapes whose time had passed. There are traditions in various cultures of deliberately burying sacred spaces, of closing off a place that has served its purpose and should not be disturbed, of sealing something that has too much power to be left accessible. These traditions are usually read as mythological rather than historical. But in the context of what we're discussing, in the context of a highland landscape where multiple surveys have found structures apparently sealed at a specific point in time, the possibility that some of that sealing was deliberate rather than purely accidental deserves consideration. Not all of it. The peat formation was primarily a natural process driven by climate and land use. But if you knew that your landscape was changing, if you could see the bogs forming, if you watched the woodland disappearing and the water rising, and the old fields and pathways and structures being slowly covered, you might make choices about how you responded to that. You might decide that certain things should be left to be covered, that the earth was reclaiming them for a reason, that the sealing was part of a process rather than just a loss. Or you might try to prevent it and fail, and leave the structures there under the peat as silent witnesses to the end of whatever had been there. Either way, they're there, waiting. The archaeology of the next several decades is going to transform our understanding of the Scottish Highlands. There are several major research projects currently either underway or in planning stages that are going to generate data we've never had before. The Outer Hebrides, in particular, has attracted significant research interest, partly because of the Callanish complex and partly because the islands were relatively isolated from some of the later population. Movements that transformed the mainland landscape, which means they may preserve evidence of an older tradition in a less disturbed state. But the mainland highlands, the interior, the far north and west, the great peat bogs of Sutherland and Caithness, and the flow country, that vast expanse of blanket bog that covers thousands of square kilometres in the far north of Scotland, all of this remains largely terra incognita from an archaeological standpoint. The surveys that have been done are promising. The anomalies are there, but the excavation is not. The flow country is particularly interesting. It is the largest area of blanket peat in Europe. It extends over 4,000 square kilometres. It is in many ways one of the most inaccessible landscapes in Britain, crossed by few roads, subject to extreme weather, underlaid by layers of peat up to 6 meters deep in some areas. It was formed by exactly the process we've been discussing, the rapid accumulation of peat over a landscape that had previously been inhabited and managed. And it contains, according to the survey data that exists, an extraordinary density of buried features. The flow country was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2023, primarily for its ecological significance as one of the largest and most intact blanket bog ecosystems anywhere on Earth. That designation is well deserved, but it also creates a tension, because the ecological protection of the peat bog conflicts with any plans to investigate what lies beneath it. Cutting trenches into the flow country to investigate archaeological features would be damaging to the ecosystem that the UNESCO designation is meant to protect. This tension between ecological conservation and archaeological investigation is one of the central challenges facing anyone who wants to properly investigate the buried landscape of the Highlands. It's not a simple problem. The peat bog is valuable. The ecosystem it contains is irreplaceable. Destroying it to find out what's underneath is not obviously the right choice. But there are ways to approach this that don't require large-scale excavation. Non-invasive survey techniques are improving all the time. Ground-penetrating radar is becoming more sensitive and more capable of resolving fine detail at greater depths. Airborne LIDAR, which uses laser scanning to map subtle variations in surface topography, has already revealed buried features across Britain that were completely invisible to surface survey. DNA analysis of peat cores can provide information about the vegetation and environment of past landscapes without excavating the structures themselves. And there is a middle path, small targeted excavation of the most promising anomalies, with full consultation with conservation bodies and with the most careful possible approach to minimizing damage. This has been done in parts of the Highland landscape, and the results, when they come, tend to be significant. What would it take for the story of the buried Highlands to reach mainstream awareness? For the surveys and the anomalies and the scholarly caution to resolve into something that the general public could engage with in the way they engage with, say the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb or the excavation of Pompeii? It would take a discovery, a single, undeniable discovery of something beneath the Highland peat that cannot be explained by the existing models, a structure of undeniable scale and sophistication, a chamber containing evidence of its builders, something that forces the revision of the textbook narrative in a way that cannot be deferred or footnoted or described as an anomaly requiring further study. That discovery might already be buried under the flow country, under the Sutherland bog, under the moors of Wester Ross or Caithness, or the islands that guard the approach to the Highlands from the west. The surveys suggest it's there, the traditions say it's there, the place names hint at it, the folklore remembers it in distorted form. It just hasn't been dug up yet, and perhaps that's appropriate in a way. The buried landscape of the Scottish Highlands has been waiting for a very long time. For thousands of years, while languages changed and cultures rose and fell, and the world outside the bogs moved from stone tools to smartphones, the structures under the peat lay in their dark, cold, waterlogged preservation, unchanged, waiting. They are patient in a way that nothing human can be. They have already survived longer than most civilizations last. Whatever sealed them has kept them. Whatever preserves them will continue to preserve them, until the day that someone with the right tools and the right questions and the right combination of curiosity and stubbornness puts a probe into the ground in the right location and finds what's there. That day is coming, maybe sooner than we think. Let's talk about what we might actually find, not in a speculative, sensational way, but in a considered way, based on what the evidence suggests. Because I think it's worth trying to paint a picture, even an incomplete and uncertain one, of what the buried landscape of the Scottish Highlands might contain. The structures detected by geophysical surveys appear to include several different types. There are circular features, some of them quite large, that have the signature of enclosures. Wooden or stone structures, perhaps roofed, perhaps open. The size of some of these is significant. Some are too large to be domestic dwellings by the standards of the period we're talking about. They're more the size of community structures, assembly places, ritual enclosures. The kind of building that implies a community large enough and organized enough to need dedicated shared space. There are linear features that look like boundaries or pathways, field systems possibly, or trackways, evidence of movement through the landscape, on a scale that implies not just occasional passage, but regular, organized use. People coming and going along established routes, maintaining those routes, using them repeatedly. There are the larger anomalies that the survey teams have tentatively described as building platforms or structural complexes. These are harder to interpret without excavation. They might be clusters of structures, villages, or small settlements. They might be ceremonial complexes, groups of structures related to specific ritual functions. They might be something else entirely, something that we don't have a category for because we've never encountered it in an excavated form in this period. And there might be, if the oldest layers of the peat sequence are right, structures that predate any of these things. Evidence of human activity at depths that push back our understanding of organized construction in Scotland to a period that is genuinely difficult to reconcile with any current model. The preservation conditions under Highland peat are extraordinary. Organic material that would have decayed in any other environment survives intact under peat. This means that if there are wooden structures beneath the peat, they may still be there. Not just the stone and earthwork components, but the wooden elements, the posts and beams and planks. The organic material that gives you not just the shape of a structure, but information about the trees that were used, the techniques employed, the tools that cut the timber. Dendrochronology, the dating of wood by its tree rings, can provide astonishingly precise dates for preserved timber. Not just the century or the decade, but in some cases, the exact year that a tree was felled. If there is preserved timber under the Highland peat, and the peat conditions suggest there might be, then excavating it could provide a degree of chronological precision that we currently don't have for any prehistoric Scottish site. And pollen preserved in the peat layers surrounding the structures can tell us what the landscape looked like when they were in use, what plants were growing nearby, what the climate was like, whether there were agricultural fields in the vicinity, or whether the landscape was still forested. The story written in pollen is extraordinarily detailed. It can be read decade by decade through a long peat sequence, and it tells a story of landscape change that is directly relevant to understanding what was happening to the people who lived there. The buried structures of the Scottish Highlands, if and when they're excavated, will not just tell us about architecture. They'll tell us about people, about how they lived and what they ate and what the landscape looked like and how it changed, about the relationship between human activity and environmental change, about the beginning and the end of whatever was there. That's what makes this so compelling. Not just the monuments, not just the mystery, but the human story buried with them. The story of people who lived in this landscape for thousands of years, who made it their own, who encoded their understanding of it in stone and earthwork and alignment and symbol, and who are waiting under the peat to be remembered. There is a poem in the Gaelic tradition that describes the landscape of the Highlands as a body. The mountains are bones, the rivers are veins, the lakes are eyes that have been closed for a long time, waiting for someone to come and open them again. The imagery is ancient, and the poem itself may predate the period for which we have any other written record of Scottish Gaelic literature. It is one of those fragments that survives in a manuscript much later than its probable composition, the kind of text that carries echoes of something older in its language and its imagery. Whether or not the poem is as old as some scholars believe, the image it contains is resonant. The landscape as a sleeping body, closed eyes waiting to open, a depth of time that operates not in years or centuries, but in geological eons. And at the same time, a connection, a suggestion that the landscape is not dead but sleeping, not finished but paused. The buried structures of the Scottish Highlands are in that same state, paused, waiting, not gone, but sealed. The question is whether we have the curiosity, the patience, and the will to open the eyes. Now let's consider the question of what these ancient people might have known that we don't. This is always a risky territory because it's easy to slide into romanticization, into the idea that an ancient people had some kind of profound wisdom that modern science has lost, which is usually more projection than history. But there's a serious version of this question that deserves a serious answer. The people who built the monuments of the Scottish Highlands, whenever exactly they lived and whatever exactly they built, were operating with a knowledge system that was fundamentally different from ours in its structure. We tend to organize knowledge into disciplines, into separate bodies of information that we keep in different containers and hand off to different specialists. Astronomy is a different thing from agriculture. Architecture is a different thing from religion. Medicine is a different thing from geography. But in the knowledge systems of prehistoric cultures, all of these things were integrated. The astronomical knowledge that allowed you to build a monument aligned to the solstice was also the agricultural knowledge that told you when to plant. It was also the religious knowledge that connected the movements of celestial bodies to the powers that governed the natural world. It was also the architectural knowledge that let you orient a building precisely without modern instruments. These weren't separate things. They were one thing. a unified understanding of how the world works that was simultaneously practical and sacred. The Highland monuments are evidence of that integrated knowledge. The alignments that mark solstice sunrises are not purely astronomical or purely religious. They're both. The chambered cairns that orient their passages to specific celestial events are not purely funerary or purely astronomical. They're both. The recumbent stone circles that track the moon are not purely astronomical or purely social. They're all of those things simultaneously. What we've lost, or rather what we've separated out into different disciplines that don't always talk to each other, is the integration, the sense that understanding the sky and understanding the earth and understanding the community and understanding the dead and understanding the divine are all aspects of a single understanding. The people who built those things hadn't lost that integration because they hadn't made the separation in the first place. That's what made them capable of achievements that still impress us. Not a different kind of intelligence, but a different way of organizing knowledge, a way that we've largely abandoned and might benefit from recovering in some form. The buried landscape of the Scottish Highlands is, among other things, a record of that integrated knowledge system, a physical expression of a way of understanding the world that kept a community alive and functional in a demanding environment for thousands of years. And the fact that it's buried rather than destroyed means that record is still there, still recoverable, still potentially legible to people with the right questions and the right tools. I want to say something about the people who currently live in the Highlands, because this isn't just ancient history in the sense of something that happened long ago and stopped mattering. The communities of the Scottish Highlands carry this history in their landscape, in their traditions, in their relationship to the land. The Highland clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries removed the majority of the Gaelic-speaking population from the inland and coastal communities they had occupied for generations. They were moved to make way for sheep farms and later for deer forests and grouse moors. The communities that remained were reduced, concentrated on the coasts, their relationship to the interior landscape severed. And with those communities went the last living carriers of the knowledge traditions that had been accumulating in the Highlands for thousands of years. The plant knowledge, the astronomical traditions, the understanding of the sacred landscape. That loss was enormous, and it was recent. Within living memory of people still alive today, there were communities in the Highlands whose grandparents had carried knowledge of places and traditions that went back to a time before any written record. That knowledge is mostly gone now. Some fragments were collected by folklore scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But what was recorded is a small fraction of what existed, and what exists now is a small fraction of what was recorded. The buried structures of the Highland peat are the material remains of the civilization that created those knowledge traditions. And the loss of the living traditions makes the recovery of the material remains more important, not less. Because those material remains are the last evidence of a human presence in the Highland landscape that was once rich, diverse, sophisticated and deeply rooted. Recovering that evidence, excavating those structures, understanding what lies beneath the peat is not just an archaeological exercise. It's an act of remembrance, a restoration of historical depth to a landscape that has had its deep history obscured by 5,000 years of peat accumulation and several centuries of deliberate cultural erasure. The Highland landscape deserves to have its full history told. Not just the medieval castles and the Jacobite risings and the romantic wilderness of the Victorian tourist imagination, but the deep history that lies beneath. The 10,000 years of human presence that preceded all of that. The communities that oriented their buildings to the stars and buried their dead in stone chambers and managed the land with a sophistication that we're only beginning to appreciate. That story is still there, sealed beneath the Highland peat, waiting to be read. Let me tell you about one more thing before we start to bring this together. There's a tradition in parts of the Highlands and Islands of what's called the duthchas, a Gaelic concept that is usually translated as something like native place or homeland, but which carries connotations that no simple English translation quite captures. Duthchas is not just the place you come from, it's a relationship between a community and a landscape, that extends across generations. It's the inherited right to and responsibility for a particular piece of land. It's the accumulated knowledge of that land that passes from parent to child. It's the emotional and spiritual connection to the specific terrain, the specific hills and streams and moors, that is part of what it means to belong to a particular community. Duthchas is not ownership in the modern legal sense. It doesn't require documentation. It doesn't depend on title deeds. It's a relationship that exists whether or not it's recognized by any external authority. And it can persist across enormous spans of time. Communities in the Highlands maintained their sense of duthchas across the clearances, across generations of exile, across the loss of the language itself. The relationship to the land survived even when the people were removed from it. If that principle of persistent relationship to a specific landscape operates across several centuries of diaspora, how far back does it go in its older, intact form? The communities who maintained duthchas in the Highlands of the 18th century were the descendants of communities who had been in those landscapes for a very long time. Their relationship to their specific places was not new. It had been built up over generations, over centuries, possibly over millennia. And the knowledge that was part of that relationship, the knowledge of the specific qualities of specific places, of which hills and glens and lochs had which kinds of significance, of where the old paths ran and where the old structures were, that knowledge was also not new. It was accumulated over the same long time span. Some of what the folklore says about specific places in the Highland landscape, some of the stories about which hills are hollow and which lochs contain old things and which moorlands should not be disturbed, that knowledge may be genuinely old, not thousands of years old in its current form. Languages change and stories are retold and details are modified. But the localization, the specific identification of specific places as having specific qualities, that specificity may preserve something real, a genuine historical memory of what was there before the peat covered it. The duthchas tradition, in other words, may be one of the mechanisms by which very old knowledge of the Highland landscape has persisted, imperfectly, distorted by time and translation and cultural change, but persistent, pointing, even across millennia, toward the places where the buried evidence is. And when you overlay the locations identified in folklore and tradition as significant, with the anomalies detected by geophysical surveys, the correspondence is not perfect, but it's not random either. The places that people have always treated as special, that have always been avoided or revered or approached with caution, tend to be places where there is something underground. That tells us something important. It tells us that the memory of what lies beneath the peat has survived in some form, even if the specific knowledge of what it is has been lost. The landscape itself has not forgotten. The communities who lived closest to it kept something alive in their stories and their traditions, even when they didn't fully understand what they were keeping. That's one of the most remarkable aspects of this whole story. That human memory, operating through story and tradition and the specific attachment to specific places that duthchas represents, has been preserving a rough outline of archaeological knowledge for thousands of years. Not perfectly, not in a form that an archaeologist would recognize as information, but in a form that, when compared with the survey data, reveals something that no amount of scientific survey alone could reveal. The persistence of human presence in the Highland landscape and the persistence of human memory of what that presence created. We are not disconnected from the people who built those buried structures. We are their descendants, in a sense more than just the genetic one. We inhabit the same landscape. We use the same names for the same rivers and mountains. We feel the same things when we stand on the same hillsides at the same times of year. The relationship doesn't require us to have preserved specific knowledge of what lies under the peat. The relationship is in the landscape itself. And when we finally excavate those buried structures, when we bring what lies beneath the Highland peat back into the light, we will not be encountering strangers. We will be encountering predecessors. People who understood this landscape, who organized their lives around it, who built their most significant places in and on it, who sealed their world under it when that world ended. We will be reading their letter, a letter written in stone and earthwork, and alignment and symbol, sealed under 4,000 years of peat, addressed to whoever comes along with the curiosity to open it. The Highland landscape is waiting for that moment. The peat is patient. The structures beneath it are intact, preserved by the same cold, dark, acidic water that buried them. The anomalies are on the survey maps. The research projects are underway, slowly, in the measured way of academic archaeology. And somewhere out there in the Flow Country, or the Sutherland uplands, or the remote northwest glens where no road runs for 20 miles, there is a place where the peat is a little thinner, where the ground-penetrating radar has found something that no one has yet excavated, where the site is on a waiting list for further investigation, that nobody knows when will happen. That place holds a secret that predates Stonehenge, a secret that predates the pyramids, a secret older than any civilization that made it into the textbooks. It's waiting there in the dark and the cold, under the peat and the heather and the Highland sky. And one day, we're going to open the ground and find it. I want to close with something that feels important to say. The story of the Scottish Highlands and the story of what might lie beneath the peat is not a story about ancient mysteries in the sensational sense of that term. It's not a story about lost civilizations with technology we can't explain, or visitors from other worlds, or anything that requires us to abandon rational inquiry. Everything I've described is based on real evidence, real survey data, real archaeological findings, real genetic analysis, real scholarly debate. What it requires is not the abandonment of reason, but an expansion of our assumptions, an acknowledgement that we've been systematically underestimating the people of the deep past, that our models of what was possible in the Mesolithic and early Neolithic are too conservative, that the evidence is pushing those models in a direction that the existing frameworks don't quite accommodate. That happens in science. It happens in archaeology especially, where the physical evidence is always incomplete and the temptation to build a model on insufficient data is always present. Every generation of archaeologists inherits models from the previous generation and has to decide which of those models to revise and which to maintain. The best archaeologists are the ones who are honest about the uncertainty, who say clearly what we know and what we don't, what the evidence shows and what it merely suggests, what would change their minds and what they would accept as confirmation. The buried landscape of the Scottish Highlands is exactly the kind of evidence that, when properly excavated and analysed, has the potential to change minds. Not about everything, not about the basic framework of human evolution and the development of modern human behaviour, but about the specific history of the British Isles, about when organised, sophisticated human communities appeared in Scotland, about how those communities were connected to each other and to the wider Atlantic world, about how long the tradition of monument building and astronomical observation and landscape management in Scotland really is. That's worth knowing. That's worth the effort of excavation and the challenge of funding and the institutional risk of finding something that doesn't fit. The Highland landscape holds the answer to questions we haven't fully formulated yet, because we don't quite know what to ask, because we don't know exactly what's there, and that's perhaps the most exciting thing about it. We're not just looking for confirmation of what we suspect. We're looking for whatever is actually there. And whatever is actually there, whatever the peat has preserved in its dark, cold archive, is going to be stranger and more interesting than anything we've imagined. The Scottish Highlands are not just a beautiful landscape. They are a library, a sealed archive of human history that goes back to the edge of living memory and beyond. A collection of evidence that, once accessed, will change how we understand who we are and where we come from and how long we've been here. The peat is patient, the stones are waiting, and the story they contain is older than anything we've put in the textbooks. It begins before the beginning of recorded history, in the cold and the dark and the ancient rock of the Highland landscape, in the hands of people who understood this land in ways we've forgotten, who built things we haven't found yet, who sealed their world under the bog and went on to become, in some sense, us. We owe it to them to look, to dig, to ask the questions that the evidence is pointing us toward. Because what lies beneath the Scottish Highlands isn't just history, it's memory. And memory, even very old memory, even memory sealed under 4,000 years of peat, is worth recovering. The Highland peat is cold and dark and patient. The structures beneath it are intact and waiting. The story they contain is the oldest story in Britain. One day, we're going to tell it, and on that day, we'll understand something about ourselves that we've been missing for a very long time. Something ancient is sealed beneath the Scottish Highlands. It's older than Stonehenge. It's older than the pyramids. It's older than any civilization that made it into the history books. And it's waiting, right beneath our feet, in the dark, in the cold, in the peat, waiting to be remembered, waiting to come back into the light. Rest now. Let the Highland landscape settle around you. Let the stones and the peat and the cold, dark water do what they've been doing for thousands of years. Waiting, holding, keeping the secrets until the moment is right. Whatever lies beneath that bog was built by people who looked up at the same stars you're under tonight, who felt the same pull of mystery, who asked the same questions about where they came from and what it all meant. They sealed their answers under the earth. We're slowly learning to read the seal. Sleep now. The Highlands are patient. The story will be there when you wake. It always has been. There is a valley in the far northwest of Scotland, between the mountains of Assynt and the coast of Sutherland, where the landscape does something unusual. It folds in on itself in ways that the maps don't quite capture. The contour lines suggest terrain that should be open moorland, exposed and readable from a distance. But when you walk into it, the valley closes around you and the horizon disappears, and you find yourself in a space that feels contained, protected, deliberately shaped. Local people who know the area describe a particular section of this valley where the ground is softer than it should be, where the heather grows differently, in circular patterns that don't follow the natural drainage, where the midges, which are everywhere in the Highlands in summer, seem to be fewer than they should be, where the deer avoid certain sections of ground as if they've decided those sections belong to something else. A walker who spent 3 weeks surveying on foot the terrain of the Northwest Highlands in the early 2000s described this valley in a journal that was eventually published privately in a small edition. He described standing in the valley at dusk and feeling, with absolute conviction, that the ground beneath him was hollow, not dangerous, not threatening, just hollow, like the surface of a drum. He described tapping his boot against the ground and thinking he could hear a faint resonance that shouldn't be there. He noted the circular heather patterns and estimated them at roughly 15 to 20 meters in diameter. He noted the softness of the ground over those circles compared to the surrounding terrain. And he noted that the whole section of the valley, where these features occurred, aligned, when he checked his compass, along a bearing that pointed directly toward a prominent mountain to the southeast. That mountain, when viewed from the valley on the winter solstice, frames the rising sun in a notch between its two highest peaks. The walker was not an archaeologist. He had no particular background in prehistory. He was simply a man who liked walking in difficult terrain and who paid close attention to what he saw. But what he described, the circular ground anomalies, the alignment toward an astronomically significant landscape feature, the differential vegetation, is exactly what you'd expect to see on the surface over buried prehistoric structures. Nobody has ever surveyed that valley with ground-penetrating radar. Nobody has ever taken soil cores from those circular heather patches. Nobody has formally documented the alignment. The journal exists, the description is there, and the valley is waiting. That story is not unique. Across the Highlands, there are accounts like this in local archives and private publications and the notes of rambling clubs and natural history societies. Observations made by careful, attentive people who weren't archaeologists and didn't know the significance of what they were describing. Records that exist, but that haven't been systematically compiled or analysed. A vast informal archaeology that has never been connected to the formal archaeological record. One of the most valuable things that could be done for our understanding of the buried Highland landscape is a systematic review of these informal records, going through the archives of local history societies, reading the Victorian travel literature that describes Highland walks in detail, looking at the field notes of 19th century naturalists who moved through the landscape on foot and noticed things, compiling the accounts of ground anomalies and circular formations and alignment suggestive features from all of these sources and mapping them against the existing survey data. That kind of archival research is not glamorous. It doesn't produce dramatic results quickly. It requires patience and breadth of reading and the ability to recognize significance in descriptions that weren't written with significance in mind. But it has been done in other contexts, and it has produced as genuine discoveries. Cases where an offhand remark in a Victorian travel diary turns out to correspond to a previously unidentified archaeological site. Cases where the accumulated observations of a dozen casual walkers, taken together, reveal a pattern that no single observer could have seen. The informal record of the Scottish Highlands is rich, richer, probably, than anyone has yet appreciated, and within it, distributed across a century and a half of walking and observing and writing, there may be the rough outlines of the buried landscape, seen from the surface by people who didn't know what they were looking at. Let me tell you about something that the peat has already given back. Because while most of the story I've been telling is about what's still buried and still waiting, there are cases where the Highland peat has surrendered its contents under specific circumstances. And those cases tell us something important about what we might expect when larger-scale excavation finally happens. Peat cutting, the traditional practice of cutting and drying peat for fuel, has been going on in Scotland for centuries. In the most remote parts of the Highlands and Islands, where peat was essentially the only available fuel, communities have been cutting peat banks for generations. And over those generations, the cutters have been finding things. Mostly what they find is wood, preserved tree roots and trunks from the forest that preceded the peat, lying in the lower layers. Sometimes they find these in quantities that tell a story about the original landscape, about how dense the forest was and how suddenly it died. The Scots pine stumps embedded in the base of the peat across much of the Highlands are themselves significant evidence of the abrupt landscape change we've been discussing. But sometimes the peat cutters find other things: tools, weapons, objects of worked wood and leather and bone that have been preserved by the peat just as well as the timber was preserved. A wooden bowl, complete and intact, showing clear tool marks from its manufacture. A leather shoe, preserved so well that you can see the stitching. An axe handle, still fitted to its stone head. The binding that holds them together still present. These objects are more common in the peat record than most people realize. They've been found across the Highlands and Islands, turned up by peat cutters and drainage workers, and occasionally by storm erosion on coastal bogs. Most of them made it into local museums. Some were lost or discarded because their finders didn't recognize their significance. And most of them have been dated, when dated at all, to relatively recent periods, the Iron Age or the early medieval period. But some of them are older. Some of the wooden objects found in Highland peat have been dated to the Neolithic or earlier, worked wood that represents deliberate human construction rather than natural timber. And these older objects are the ones that matter most for what we're discussing, because they confirm what the geophysical surveys suggest, that there are human-made things under the Highland peat at depths that correspond to very early dates. There's a particularly striking case from Orkney, not the mainland Highlands, I know, but relevant because Orkney peat forms under similar conditions and the preservation is similar. In the 1990s, a peat cutter working on a bog in the south of mainland Orkney turned up what appeared to be a worked wooden post, a length of timber that had clearly been shaped by tools, with what appeared to be a tenon end cut at one end, the kind of joint used in timber construction. When the post was dated, the results came back at around 5,000 years ago, early Neolithic. The tenon joint that it preserved tells us that early Neolithic builders in the British Isles were using mortise and tenon joints, a technique usually associated with much later carpentry. They were jointing their timbers with a degree of sophistication that the standard account of Neolithic construction didn't predict. If that degree of timber sophistication existed in Orkney 5,000 years ago, what was happening in the mainland Highlands at the same period? In the places we haven't excavated yet? In the bogs that the drainage workers haven't cut into? In the valleys where the heather grows in suspicious circles and the deer avoid certain patches of ground? The peat has given back hints, isolated objects, fragments of the larger picture, enough to know that there is more there, enough to know that the level of preservation is extraordinary, enough to suggest that what lies at depth under the Highland peat, in the places the surveys are detecting, will be significantly better preserved than anything we've dug up from exposed ground. Archaeology is always working with the fragmentary, with what survived and what could be found. The standard bias is toward things that are made of hard material and things that are in accessible locations. Stone and bone and fired pottery in places that were on known routes of investigation. The softer material, the organic material, the things made of wood and leather and plant fiber that constitute the majority of any culture's material world, those are almost always lost to decay. The Highland peat is an exception. Under the right peat conditions, all of that fragile organic material survives. The wooden tools, the leather clothing, the woven baskets, the plant fibers used for binding and rope, the food remains. The traces of plant medicine and dye and pigment preparation. Everything that ordinary archaeology never gets to see. When we finally excavate the right site under the Highland peat, we won't just be finding structures. We'll be finding the contents of those structures. The everyday world of people who lived in the Highlands thousands of years ago, preserved in a level of detail that nowhere else in Britain can match. That is a genuinely extraordinary prospect. The question of why this matters in the present tense, not just as historical curiosity, but as something with implications for how we understand ourselves and our relationship to the past, is one I keep returning to. We live in a culture that is, in various ways, experiencing a crisis of historical depth. We tend to think of ourselves as the endpoint of history, as the generation for whom everything that came before was merely preparation. Our technology feels unprecedented. Our problems feel unprecedented. Our disconnection from the natural world, from the specific landscapes and their specific qualities, feels like a condition we invented. But the buried landscape of the Scottish Highlands is a reminder that none of this is true, that people have been living in sophisticated relationship with Northern European landscapes for a very long time, that the tradition of understanding a specific landscape, of encoding that understanding in physical structures, of maintaining that understanding across generations through a combination of physical presence and cultural transmission, is not a primitive condition that we've advanced beyond. It's a human capacity that we've largely abandoned, and that abandonment has costs. The Highlands were not always a wild and empty landscape. The image of the Highlands as wilderness, as emptiness, as a dramatic backdrop for adventure and tourism, is a recent construction. It reflects the history of the clearances, the enforced removal of the population that had lived there for thousands of years. Before the clearances, the Highland landscape was full of people, full of communities that knew every inch of their specific territory, full of the accumulated knowledge of generations living in relationship with a demanding but rewarding environment. Before those communities, there were earlier communities, doing the same things, in an earlier form, with earlier tools, building, organizing, understanding, maintaining their relationship with the landscape across the generations. And before those communities, there were the builders of the buried structures, the people, the peat is keeping for us, whose relationship with the Highland landscape was so deep and so old and so detailed that they were able to orient their buildings to astronomical events and maintain traditions of knowledge that persisted for thousands of years. We are the inheritors of that long history. Even those of us who have never been to Scotland, who have no particular connection to the Highlands, because the habits of mind that made those ancient communities work, the capacity for long-term thinking, for integrated knowledge, for relationship with specific places, for the kind of patient observation that allows you to build a monument aligned to an event that only happens once every 19 years, those are human capacities. They're in the repertoire of what human beings can do. They're not gone. They're just not being exercised. Recovering the physical evidence of how those capacities were once deployed in the Highlands, in those buried structures, is part of how we might begin to exercise them again. Not by becoming hunter-gatherers or Neolithic farmers, but by understanding that the problems we face now, the relationship between human activity and environmental change, the question of how to maintain complex knowledge across generations, the challenge of organizing communities around shared goals that extend beyond individual lifetimes. These are not new problems. They are very old problems, and the people who built those buried structures had developed approaches to them that worked for thousands of years. That knowledge is sealed under the peat along with the structures, in the pattern of the alignments, in the choice of building materials, in the relationship between one structure and another, in the orientation of passages to specific celestial events, in the evidence of land use that the pollen cores will reveal when someone takes them. It's worth excavating, not just for the historical knowledge, but for the wisdom. There's a particular quality to the light in the Highlands in late October. The sun is low on the southern horizon, and it angles through the landscape in long golden shafts that pick out details the summer light misses. Ridgelines that seem flat in summer reveal subtle undulations. Boggy ground that looks uniform shows unexpected dry hummocks. Earthworks that are invisible under summer vegetation become apparent as gentle shadows across the landscape. Archaeologists call this raking light, and it's one of the most useful tools in the field archaeologists' kit. Photograph Highland terrain from the air on a clear October afternoon, and features that were completely invisible in the summer photographs leap out of the landscape in stark relief. The outlines of field systems, the subtle curves of circular enclosures, the straight lines of pathways or boundaries, the unexpected regularity of features that look natural until you see them from the air in the right light. Aerial photography of the Highlands in raking light conditions has been going on since the 1950s. The results have filled archives with photographs of features that are unidentified, undated, unexplained. Some of these features are medieval or later. Some are clearly Bronze Age or Iron Age, matching the types of structures from those periods that are found across Britain. But some are neither. Some don't match any recognized type of feature from any period. And some of those unmatched features are clustered in specific areas of the Highlands, appearing together in a way that suggests they're related, that they form a coherent complex rather than isolated anomalies. The problem is that aerial photographs can reveal the presence of features, but they can't tell you what those features are or how old they are. For that, you need ground survey and eventual excavation. And the leap from archive photograph to ground investigation is one that the available resources don't always allow. There are databases of aerial photographic evidence for Scotland that contain records of thousands of features across the Highland landscape that have never been followed up. Underfunded survey programs, understaffed regional offices of Historic Environment Scotland, a constant struggle to do justice to the scale of the resource with the available means. The features are known, they're on the maps, they're in the databases, and they're waiting for the ground investigation that would turn them from archive photographs into understood history. One of the things that the development of satellite imagery and publicly accessible remote sensing has done is to expand the number of eyes looking at the Highland landscape. People with an interest in archaeology and access to tools like Google Earth or Sentinel satellite imagery have been identifying features in the Highland landscape that weren't in the existing databases. Features that match the descriptions of buried archaeological sites. Features that correspond sometimes to locations identified in folklore as significant. This kind of citizen archaeology, with all its limitations and its need for expert validation, has in recent years produced genuine discoveries. Sites that weren't on any official list that have turned out to be significant when investigated. The Highlands are well suited to this kind of discovery, precisely because so much of the landscape is accessible to satellite imagery, and so much of it has never been properly surveyed. The convergence of accessible remote sensing tools, improving geophysical survey technology, growing awareness of the evidence for a buried Highland landscape, and increasing scholarly willingness to consider the possibility that the Mesolithic people of Scotland were doing more than the standard model allows, all of this is creating a situation where major discoveries are increasingly likely. The discovery that will change the narrative might be made by a professional archaeologist with a major research grant. It might equally be made by a citizen scientist with a laptop and access to satellite imagery who notices something that the professionals missed. It might be made by a peat cutter turning a bank and finding something that doesn't look like natural timber. It might be made by a geophysicist running a routine survey for an environmental impact assessment who gets an anomalous reading and decides to investigate. In science, the major discoveries often happen, not where you're looking, but where you happen to look next. The Highland landscape is so extensive and so under-investigated that the next place you look is almost always somewhere that's never been systematically examined. And in that context, almost any direction of gaze has the potential to reveal something significant. The buried landscape of the Scottish Highlands is patient. Whatever is sealed under the peat has been there for thousands of years and will continue to be there for as long as the peat persists. Its preservation doesn't depend on our urgency. It doesn't require us to act now or lose the opportunity, but our opportunity to learn from it, to recover its evidence and integrate it into our understanding of who we are and where we come from, that is bounded, not by the preservation of the evidence, but by the preservation of the traditions and the landscapes and the communities that provide context for the evidence. The Gaelic language, which preserves in its vocabulary and its place, names and its poetry fragments of a very old understandings of the Highland landscape, is endangered. The communities that maintain living connections to the Highland landscape, the crofters and the fishermen and the keepers of the old traditions, are under continuing economic and social pressure. The landscape itself faces pressures from forestry, from renewable energy development, from changing agricultural economics that are reshaping its character in ways that may affect both the peat preservation and the cultural connections that give the archaeological evidence its meaning. The time to do this research is now, not because the evidence will disappear quickly, but because the context in which that evidence can be fully understood is under pressure. Every generation that passes without a serious effort to integrate the informal knowledge of the Highland communities, the place name traditions, the folklore, the duthchas understanding of the landscape, with the formal archaeological survey record, is a generation where that integration becomes harder and less complete. The buried structures under the Highland peat are waiting, but the human knowledge that helps us understand why they were built, where they were built, and what they meant to the people who built them, that knowledge has a shorter waiting time. There is a man, now in his 90s, who lives on the west coast of Sutherland. His family has farmed the same ground for as many generations as local records can trace. He speaks Gaelic as his first language, and he knows the names of every feature in the landscape within a 10-mile radius of his family's land, in both English and Gaelic, and in some cases in a form that he learned from his grandfather, that neither he nor anyone he's spoken to can explain etymologically. Names that don't resolve into Gaelic roots, names that are older than Gaelic. He knows, because his grandmother told him and her mother told her, that certain sections of the bog that his family cuts for fuel should not be cut too deep. Not because there's anything dangerous there, but because there are things there that belong to the land and not to people. He doesn't think about this in archaeological terms. He thinks about it in terms of a tradition that his family has maintained without fully understanding why. But when he describes the locations of these sections of bog that shouldn't be cut too deep, they correspond to some of the areas where geophysical surveys have detected anomalies. He probably doesn't know about the surveys, and the people who ran the surveys probably don't know about his family's tradition. The two kinds of knowledge, the scientific and the traditional, are sitting in separate compartments, pointing at the same places, without being able to speak to each other. Bridging that gap is one of the most important and most neglected tasks in Highland archaeology. Not just using the traditional knowledge as a pointer towards sites, though that's valuable, but recognizing the traditional knowledge as a form of knowledge in its own right, a record, however distorted by time, of what the Highland landscape was and what it contained and what it meant to the people who lived in it. The man in Sutherland has a name for the section of bog his family doesn't cut too deep. The name means, roughly, the sleeping place of the old ones. He says it with matter-of-fact calm. It's a name, a description. It tells you what the place is. He doesn't know who the old ones are. He doesn't know when they started sleeping there, or what they looked like or what they built. But the name has been there for as long as his family has been there. And somewhere under that section of bog, under the peat that he cuts around rather than through, there is something that the geophysical surveys have detected and that his family's tradition has remembered: the sleeping place of the old ones. It's an apt description when you think about it. Whatever is under the peat is not dead. It's preserved, it's intact, it's waiting in a kind of archaeological sleep, in the cold and the dark, for someone to come along and wake it up. And when it wakes, when the excavation finally happens, and the structures are exposed, and the datable material is recovered, and the analysis is done, and the papers are published, the story they tell will be one of the most remarkable in British archaeology. The story of a civilization older than anything in the textbooks, built in stone and wood and earthwork in one of the most remote and demanding landscapes in Europe, oriented to the stars with a precision that implies generations of careful observation, connected to a wider Atlantic world by maritime traditions that we're only beginning to recognize, and sealed, in the end, by the same process of landscape change that its own activities helped create. That's a story worth telling, worth digging for, worth the effort and the expense and the institutional risk of finding something that doesn't fit. The Highland peat is keeping it for us, keeping it intact, keeping it safe, until we're ready to receive it. The story of the Scottish Highlands and what lies beneath is ultimately not just a story about the past. It's a story about attention, about what happens when you pay close attention to a landscape over a very long time, when you notice not just what's on the surface, but what might be below, when you listen to the traditions and the names and the folklore, as well as to the data from the instruments, when you understand that the evidence doesn't only come in forms that fit the existing frameworks. The people who built whatever lies under that peat were paying attention in that way. They were attending to their landscape with a depth and a consistency that we've largely lost. And the traces they left are there for us, sealed and waiting, as evidence not just of what they built, but of what it means to truly inhabit a place. We are beginning to pay that kind of attention again. Not in all the ways that matter, not with the kind of integrated, multi-generational, full-bodied attention that built the monuments of the prehistoric Highlands, but in the small ways that science allows, with radar and satellite imagery, and ancient DNA analysis, and pollen coring and careful archival research. With the slow accumulation of evidence that eventually, in science as in life, reaches a tipping point where what was suggestive becomes convincing and what was anomalous becomes understood. That tipping point is not yet reached for the buried Highland landscape. We're still in the phase of suggestive evidence, still accumulating the anomalies, still writing the cautious reports that recommend further investigation. But the accumulation is happening faster than it used to. The tools are better, the researchers are more numerous, the public interest is greater. The institutional willingness to take on difficult questions is slowly growing. And the evidence from the surveys and the genetics and the pollen records and the informal observations keeps pointing in the same direction, towards something significant beneath the Highland peat, something older than the textbooks allow, something built by people who understood their landscape with a depth we've forgotten and might be ready to remember. The stones are waiting, the peat is patient, the story is there, sealed in the dark and the cold. We just have to be ready to listen. Across the Atlantic, in the northeastern corner of the North American continent, there are traditions among certain indigenous communities that describe visitors arriving from the east, from across the sea. In the far past, in the time of the grandfathers' grandfathers, stretched back beyond memory. Visitors in boats who came for a time and then went back across the water. These traditions have been documented by ethnographers working with those communities over the past century and a half. They're described variously as historical memory, as mythological narrative, as spiritual teaching story. The communities themselves often don't draw hard lines between these categories. A story can be all of those things simultaneously. What's interesting about these Eastern visitor traditions, from the perspective of what we've been discussing, is their specificity. They describe not just strangers in boats, but people with particular qualities. People who were skilled navigators, who understood the stars, who carried practices and knowledge that were connected to stone and to the sky, who came from a place far to the east where the winters were cold and the land had a particular character, who seemed, when they appeared, to already have some knowledge of the Atlantic and its patterns, as if this was not their first crossing. These traditions are not uniform across the northeastern indigenous communities. They appear in some groups and not others. They appear in different forms in different places, and they are not the primary focus of any of the communities that hold them. They're a strand in a much larger and more complex body of tradition. But their existence is worth noting, because if people from the Atlantic fringe of Britain, from the communities that built the monuments of the Highlands and the Hebrides and the Atlantic seaboard, were making transatlantic contacts in the pre-Columbian period, you would expect to find traces of those contacts in the traditions of the communities they encountered. Not large traces, not decisive proof, but something, a strand in the tradition, a memory, however distorted, of encounters with people who came from across the water. The Eastern visitor traditions in northeastern North American indigenous oral history might be that something. They might not. The evidence doesn't permit certainty. But in a field where evidence is always fragmentary and certainty is always provisional, the convergence of these traditions with the genetic evidence for pre-Columbian North Atlantic contact and with the archaeological evidence for sophisticated Atlantic seafaring in the British Isles is at least worth taking seriously. The Scottish Highlands produced sailors. The evidence for that is in the archaeology of the Atlantic coast, in the distribution of artifacts and raw materials across the western seaboard, in the genetic connections between island populations and mainland ones. The people who built Callanish were part of a maritime culture. The people who built the buried structures of the Highland interior were connected to that maritime culture. And that maritime culture extended, along the Atlantic seaboard, from the Outer Hebrides south to Brittany and Portugal, and from Orkney and Shetland north toward Iceland and the Faroe Islands. That is most of the way to North America by the northern route. And people who could navigate from Orkney to Shetland in hide boats were people who could navigate from Shetland to the Faroes. And people who could navigate from the Faroes to Iceland were people who could navigate from Iceland to Greenland. And people who could navigate the waters around Greenland were people who could see, on a clear day from a high point on the Greenland coast, the mountains of Baffin Island across the Davis Strait. The journey is not impossible. It's not even implausible. It's the same journey that the Norse made, 1,000 years ago, following a route that may have been known for much longer. The Norse were not the discoverers of the western route. They were the first people to leave written records of it. And behind the written Norse records, there may be a much longer history of Atlantic crossings that left no written record, but that left traces in the genetics of the populations on both sides and in the traditions of communities that had reason to remember encounters with people from far away. The Scottish Highlands are part of that story. The people who built the buried structures under the Highland peat were the ancestors, in various senses, of the people who eventually sailed the North Atlantic. Their knowledge, their tradition of astronomical observation, their maritime capability, their organized community structure, all of this contributed to the culture that eventually produced the Atlantic voyagers. And the evidence of their presence, their sophistication, their achievements is sealed under the peat of the Highlands, waiting for us to recover it. When we do, we'll understand not just what happened in Scotland in the deep past, but how Scotland was connected to a much wider world, to the Atlantic world, to the communities that faced them across the ocean, to the long, complex, largely unrecorded story of human movement and encounter across the North Atlantic that forms one of the missing chapters of world history. The Scottish Highlands are not peripheral to that story. They are, in a very real sense, its centre. Let me circle back to where we started. That moment before dawn in the Highlands, when the silence settles and the land holds its breath, and you feel something that's hard to put into words. That sense of not being quite alone. That presence that seems to press up from beneath the earth. Now you know something about what that presence might be. Not supernatural, not metaphysical, not outside the domain of evidence and inquiry and rational investigation, but old, genuinely old, older than the textbooks say it should be. The accumulated presence of thousands of years of human habitation in a landscape that has been more deeply inhabited than its surface suggests. The traces of structures and alignments and earthworks and pathways, all sealed under the peat, all preserving the physical record of communities that were here long before anyone wrote anything down. The feeling you get in the Highlands at dawn is the feeling of all that history, compressed and sealed under the heather and the bog, pressing up toward the surface. Looking for acknowledgement, asking to be recognized, we're beginning to recognize it. Slowly, with the tools of modern science and the patience of academic inquiry, we're beginning to see what's there, beginning to understand that the Highland landscape is not empty, but full of sealed evidence, full of buried history, full of the physical record of a human presence that goes back to the very edge of what we mean by history. The stones are waiting, the structures are intact, the pollen is preserved, the traditions are fading, but not yet gone. The surveys have found the anomalies. The researchers are writing the papers. The funding bodies are, slowly, beginning to take the question seriously. The moment of discovery is getting closer. And on that morning, when someone puts a probe into the Highland peat in the right location and finds the first coherent evidence of what lies beneath, the story of the Scottish Highlands will change. The story of British prehistory will change. The story we tell about who we are and where we come from and how long we've been doing this will change. That story has always been longer and stranger and more remarkable than we thought. The buried landscape of the Scottish Highlands is the latest evidence of that, the newest reason to look again at what we think we know, the most recent reminder that the past is not finished, that it's not past, that it's sealed under our feet, intact and waiting in the dark and the cold and the ancient peat, for us to come along and find it. The Scottish Highlands are patient. The peat is dark. The stones are waiting, and something ancient is sealed beneath it all. Older than Stonehenge, older than the textbooks, older than the names we have for the periods we've assigned to it. It's there, under the peat, in the Highland dark, waiting for the morning when we finally dig it up and read it. Sleep now. Let the Highland night settle around you. Let the wind come off the mountains and across the moor. Let the stars turn overhead. They're the same stars that the builders of those buried structures watched, the same stars they aligned their monuments to, the same stars that the Atlantic sailors used to navigate the ocean that lies beyond the western horizon. You're connected to all of that, by the thread of time, by the long chain of human presence in this northern European landscape that goes back further than anyone has yet fully acknowledged. The Highland peat is keeping the evidence for us, keeping it safe in the cold and the dark, waiting for the day when we're ready to receive it. Rest now. The stones are patient. The story will be there when you wake. It always has been. There's a moment that happens in archaeological fieldwork that people who've experienced it describe in remarkably similar terms. You're surveying ground, looking at data, processing readings, and then something shifts in the numbers. A pattern emerges in the data that shouldn't be there. An alignment appears in the readings that is too regular, too consistent, too geometrically precise to be natural. And you realize with a strange quietness, rather than excitement, that you're looking at something made, something built, something that a human mind designed and human hands constructed at some point in the deep past. People who've experienced that moment in the Scottish Highlands describe it differently from the same experience in other places. The scale of the Highland landscape, the depth of time it represents, the weight of the Lewisian gneiss beneath your feet and the ancient peat around you makes the moment different, more resonant, more weighted with something that goes beyond the scientific significance of the finding. Because in the Highlands, when you find something made beneath the peat, you're not finding an isolated artifact. You're finding evidence of a community, of generations of people in continuous relationship with this specific piece of land. People who knew this exact ground, these exact hills and streams, these exact sky sight lines, with an intimacy that modern life almost never produces. And what they built here, in this specific place, for their specific purposes, was important enough to seal into the landscape, to preserve, to protect. The Highland landscape was the most meaningful place in the world to the people who built those structures. It was the center of everything, the place where time and the sky and the earth and the community all came together, where the dead were honored and the living were gathered and the stars were watched and the seasons were marked and the knowledge of generations was transmitted to the next. And then it ended, or changed, or was sealed, and the people who came after wave of them, Picts and Gaels and Norsemen and English-speaking settlers and Victorian tourists and 21st century walkers with GPS devices. None of them knew what was beneath their feet. None of them knew that they were walking over a sealed world, intact under the peat, waiting, until the instruments started detecting it. The question of when the sealing happened and over what period is one of the most important questions in Highland archaeology. Because the answer tells you when the end came, when the communities that built those structures were gone or transformed beyond recognition, when the landscape they had shaped and understood and encoded was abandoned to the peat. The pollen records from different highland bogs tell slightly different stories about this. In some areas, the decline in evidence of human activity is gradual, spanning several centuries. In others, it appears quite abrupt, compressed into a few decades. In some locations, there appear to be multiple episodes of abandonment and reoccupation, as if communities left and returned, and left again before the final withdrawal. The timeframes for most of this are consistent with the period from roughly 4 to 3,000 years ago. The late Neolithic to the early Bronze Age. This is a period of significant climate deterioration across northern Europe, when temperatures dropped and rainfall increased, and the conditions that were already marginal for agriculture in the Highland interior became impossible. This climate deterioration is well documented in the pollen and sediment records from across the region, and it corresponds in time with the evidence for landscape abandonment in multiple Highland locations. But here's what's important about that timing. The period from 4 to 3,000 years ago is not before civilization in Scotland. It's in the middle of the recognised period of Neolithic and Bronze Age monument building. Callanish was still in active use during this period. The stone circles of Orkney were still being constructed. The chambered cairns were still being visited and modified. This means that the sealing of the buried Highland landscape was not simply the end of a pre-civilizational phase. It was the end of a contemporary of the recognised prehistoric civilizations of Scotland. Whatever was under the Highland peat was not a precursor to Callanish. It was contemporary with Callanish. It was part of the same cultural world, connected by the same traditions, the same astronomical knowledge, the same ways of understanding and marking the landscape. And when the interior was abandoned, when the bogs formed over the structures and the pathways and the field systems, the communities that survived moved to the coastal margins, to the more accessible and more climatically viable lowlands, carrying with them what they could of the knowledge and the tradition, reduced in numbers, changed in circumstance, but not gone. The Callanish monument complex on the Isle of Lewis survived because Lewis didn't experience the same degree of climatic deterioration that the mainland interior did. The coastal locations remained viable, and the monument at Callanish was already so central, already so embedded in the tradition of the community, that even as the world around it changed, it remained a place of gathering and ritual and astronomical observation. The Highland interior was abandoned but not forgotten. It remained in the form of the folk traditions and the place names and the duthchas understanding of specific landscapes, part of the cultural landscape of Scotland. People knew those places were significant even when they no longer knew specifically why. The hollow hills, the sleeping places of the old ones, the bogs that shouldn't be cut too deep, the hills that have something inside them, the moors where the deer don't go. That folk memory is itself a form of evidence. Evidence that the Highland communities who sealed their landscape did not simply vanish. They survived, reduced and changed, and they carried something of their understanding with them, an understanding that lost its specific content over generations, but retained its orientation toward specific places. Those places are the places where the geophysical surveys are finding anomalies, the places where the heather grows in circles and the ground sounds hollow, the sleeping places of the old ones. When the archaeologists finally excavate those places, they will be excavating not just the structures, They will be excavating the reason for the folk tradition, the physical reality that the tradition has been pointing toward for thousands of years without fully knowing what it was pointing at, and the conversation between the archaeological evidence and the folk tradition, between what the instruments detect and what the stories remember, will reveal something that neither kind of evidence alone could show. The full story of what was there and what it meant and what happened to it. Let me talk about the Brochs for a moment, because the Brochs are one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements of the prehistoric British Isles, and they're often overlooked in discussions of Scottish prehistory because they're classified as Iron Age structures and therefore fit within the recognised timeline. But the Brochs raise questions that are relevant to our broader discussion of what was happening in the Scottish Highlands before the period that's in the textbooks. A broch is a circular stone tower, hollow-walled, that rises to heights that in surviving examples reach up to 13 metres and that in their original state may have been considerably taller. The walls are hollow in the sense of having a gap between the inner and the outer faces, with corbelled chambers and staircases within the wall thickness. This hollow wall construction serves multiple purposes. It makes the structure more stable against lateral forces, provides internal spaces for storage and habitation, and allows access to upper levels without internal floors that would require large timber spans. The Brochs are found almost exclusively in Scotland, concentrated in the Northern Highlands and Islands, in Orkney and Shetland, in the Outer Hebrides, and along the north and west coasts of the Highland mainland. They're not found anywhere else in the British Isles in this form. They represent a specifically Scottish architectural tradition, and they're remarkably sophisticated. The engineering of a broch is not primitive. The hollow wall construction requires an understanding of structural mechanics that goes beyond what you'd expect from the conventional image of Iron Age builders working by trial and error. The brochs that survive, like Mauser in Shetland or Duncarloway in Lewis, are still structurally sound after 2,000 years without maintenance. Their builders knew what they were doing. Where did that knowledge come from? The brochs appear in the archaeological record in the last few centuries BC, during the Iron Age. They seem to develop quite rapidly, in architectural terms, from earlier types of roundhouse construction. But the sophistication of the mature broch design, the hollow wall engineering, the sophisticated internal arrangements, the astronomical orientations that some brochs appear to display, suggest a tradition of building knowledge that was not rapidly developed. It suggests that the broch builders were drawing on a background of architectural knowledge that was already mature. That background came from somewhere. The builders who constructed the first brochs were the descendants of people who had been building in stone in the Highlands for a very long time. The tradition of construction, of understanding how stone behaves and how to engineer structures that will stand, that tradition was ancient before the brochs were built. It was the tradition of the Neolithic tomb builders and the stone circle constructors, and going further back, the builders of the structures that now lie under the Highland peat. The brochs are not an isolated achievement. They're the late expression of a very long building tradition, specific to Scotland, specific to the Highland and Island environment, specific to the communities that had been living and building in that landscape for thousands of years. And that building tradition, that accumulated knowledge of construction and engineering and astronomical alignment and landscape use, that's what we lose sight of when we focus on the periods in isolation. When we treat the Neolithic and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age as separate chapters, rather than as a continuous story. The story is continuous. The tradition is continuous. The people who built the brochs were descended from the people who built Callanish, who were descended from the people who built the buried structures under the Highland peat. Not in a straight line, not without disruption and change and the absorption of new people and new influences, but in a real sense, a continuous inhabitation of a specific landscape, expressing itself in different forms at different times, but always rooted in the same place and the same fundamental understanding of that place. The buried landscape of the Highland peat is not an isolated chapter. It's a beginning, an earlier expression of a tradition that continued, changed, was partially interrupted by climate and population change, recovered, and eventually produced the brochs and the Pictish symbol stones, and everything else that makes the archaeology of Scotland so extraordinary. Understanding what lies under the peat will illuminate not just the buried period, but everything that came after. It will provide the deep roots of a tradition that we can see the later development of. And that will change how we read the bros and the Pictish symbols and the medieval castles and everything else that has happened in the Highland landscape since. The depth of the story matters, the roots matter, and they're under the peat. There is another way of approaching the mystery of the buried Highland landscape that I haven't discussed yet, and it's perhaps the most personal. It's the way of direct experience, of going to the places where the traditions and the survey data and the place names all point, and simply being there, paying attention, noticing what the landscape does and how it makes you feel and what seems to be present in a way that the technical description doesn't capture. I recognize that this is getting close to the territory where skeptics start to reach for their debunking tools. Feelings are not evidence. What the landscape does to your nervous system is not the same as what's underground. The sense of presence that people report in certain Highland locations might be nothing more than the atmospheric power of a dramatic landscape, acting on a human nervous system that evolved to find meaning in its environment. That's all true. Feeling something in a Highland glen is not evidence of anything except that you're a human being in a landscape that has a strong effect on human beings. But here's the thing. The locations where people consistently report feeling something, where multiple independent observers describe the same quality of presence or weight or differentness, those locations tend to cluster. And when you compare the clusters to the survey data, you find, not perfectly, but consistently enough to be interesting, a correspondence. The places that feel different to enough different people to create a consistent report tend to be places where the instruments also detect something different. This is not science. It doesn't constitute evidence in the technical sense, but it's a pattern worth noting, and it suggests that the human nervous system, which evolved to pay attention to its environment with a degree of sensitivity that our technology is only beginning to match, may be picking up on something real when it reports the presence of buried structures. Or it may not be. It may be that the places that feel different are places where the geology, or the hydrology, or the vegetation creates an atmospheric effect that produces a consistent perceptual experience without any buried structure being involved. But, in the context of the Highland landscape, where we know from other evidence that there are buried structures in unexpected locations, where the folklore has consistently identified specific places as significant for longer than we can trace, where the correspondence between the traditional knowledge and the instrument data is more than random, the possibility that direct human experience is detecting something real deserves more consideration than it usually gets. The builders of the Highland monuments were, after all, people who paid extraordinary attention to their environment, who noticed the patterns in the sky and encoded them in stone, who identified specific landscape features, specific mountain notches and ridgeline profiles, as significant and oriented their most important structures toward them. They were people who paid attention in ways that we've largely lost the habit of, and the traditions that preserved something of their understanding of the landscape may have preserved, in distorted form, something of that attention. The identification of specific places as different, as holding something, as needing respect. That respect, maintained across thousands of years in the tradition of not cutting too deep in certain sections of bog, of not building on certain hilltops, of treating certain places as belonging to the land and not to people, may be the last living trace of a knowledge tradition that once knew exactly what was there and why it mattered. The knowledge of the what and the why has been lost. What remains is the orientation, the pointing towards certain places, the maintenance of a relationship with specific landscape features that preserves the significance without preserving the understanding, and the landscape itself, the specific geological and hydrological and ecological qualities of the places that the tradition identifies as significant. Those qualities are also real. The places where the traditions point and the instruments detect and the human nervous system reports something different are often places with specific geological characteristics, places where the Lewisian gneiss is particularly close to the surface, where water behaves unusually, collecting in patterns that suggest subsurface structures, channeling or blocking drainage, where the vegetation reflects something unusual about the soil composition or the hydrology below. All of these things, the tradition and the instrument data and the geological observation and the perceptual experience, are pointing at the same locations. And the coherence of that pointing across such different kinds of evidence is itself significant. Something is there, under the Highland peat, in the specific locations that the traditions identify and the instruments detect and the human observers notice. Something that predates Stonehenge. Something built by communities that we haven't yet fully recognized or understood. Something that changed the landscape as it built, that helped create the conditions for its own burial, that is now sealed under the evidence of what it did to its environment. Something waiting to be found. Now let's think about what happens after the finding, after the excavation that will eventually happen, and the analysis that will follow, and the papers that will be published, and the textbooks that will be revised. What then? The story of what lies beneath the Highland peat is not just a historical story. It's a story with implications for the present, for how we understand the relationship between human communities and natural landscapes, for how we think about the accumulation and transmission of knowledge, for how we approach the question of what it means to be in genuine relationship with a specific place over a long period of time. The communities that built those buried structures maintained a continuous, intimate relationship with a specific piece of landscape for thousands of years. They understood it with a depth that modern land managers can barely imagine. They modified it, yes, and in modifying it, they contributed to the conditions that eventually made it uninhabitable. That's a cautionary tale with obvious modern relevance. But they also sustained it. For most of the long period during which they were present in the Highland landscape, the communities that built those structures were part of a functioning ecosystem. They were integrated into it. They managed it, in ways we're only beginning to understand, in ways that maintained its productivity and its diversity over very long timescales. That capacity for long-term sustainable landscape management, whatever form it took, is something we're desperately trying to understand in the present as we face the consequences of several centuries of landscape management that was anything but sustainable. The Highland landscape that was cleared for sheep farming in the 18th and 19th centuries is still recovering from that clearance 2 centuries later. The damage done in a few decades has taken centuries to begin to heal. The communities that managed the same landscape for thousands of years before that clearance were doing something fundamentally different, something that we don't fully understand, and understanding it, through the evidence that lies sealed under the peat, would be genuinely valuable. Not as a blueprint to be copied directly into the present, but as evidence that long-term sustainable landscape management is possible. That human communities can live in genuine relationship with a specific landscape over timescales that make our current planning horizons look laughably short. That evidence is under the peat, in the field systems and the pathways and the managed woodland and the agricultural practices that the pollen records will reveal, in the relationship between the structures and the landscape they were built in the evidence of how the community organized itself in relation to its environment over centuries and millennia. The buried landscape of the Scottish Highlands is not just an archaeological site, it's a data set, a record of how a human community managed its relationship with a northern European landscape over a very long time. A record that, when properly read, will tell us things about sustainable land management that we can't learn from any other source. That's worth digging for, not just for the historical knowledge, not just for the revision of the textbooks, but for the practical wisdom that might be encoded in the relationship between those buried structures and the landscape they were built in. The people under the peat were trying to solve some of the same problems we're trying to solve. How do you feed a community in a difficult climate? How do you organize collective work on a scale that produces results that no individual could achieve alone? How do you transmit complex knowledge about a specific landscape across generations without losing it to death or migration or cultural change? How do you maintain a functioning relationship with a natural system over time scales longer than any individual life? Those are questions that the buried evidence might help answer, in ways we can't fully predict before the excavation happens, because we don't know exactly what we'll find. But the evidence is there, sealed and waiting, and the questions are real, and the possibility of learning something genuinely useful from a very old practice of landscape management is one of the most compelling reasons to do this research. The Scottish Highlands are waiting. The peat is keeping the evidence. The traditions are fading, but still pointing toward the places. The instruments are detecting the anomalies. The researchers are writing the papers and applying for the funding and designing the surveys. The moment of discovery is coming, and when it comes, we will know something we didn't know before. Something about the depth of human presence in the northern European landscape. Something about the sophistication of the communities that lived there. Something about the relationship between human activity and natural landscape. Something about the transmission of knowledge across time. Something about the long, complex, largely unrecorded history of the Atlantic world. All of it sealed under the Highland peat. All of it intact. All of it waiting in the dark and the cold for the morning, when we finally, carefully, reverently, open the ground and bring it back into the light. The stones are patient. The peat is keeping them. The story is ready to be told. We just have to be ready to listen. Let the wind come off the mountains. Let the dark water of the Loch reflect the first light. Let the heather move in the morning air over the circular patches of ground where something sleeps beneath. Let the old names drift through the Highland languages that are slowly fading. Let the survey maps with their anomalies sit in the archive, patient as the structures they're describing. Everything is there. Everything is waiting. The Scottish Highlands hold a secret older than writing, older than the cities, older than the bronze and the iron and the stone that the textbooks begin their story with. A secret sealed under 4,000 years of peat, preserved by the cold and the dark and the acid water that buried it. One day, the ground will open. One day, the probe will find the right depth in the right location, and the readings will come back with the signature of something made, something built, something designed and constructed by human minds and human hands at a time so far before our written history that even our oldest monuments are young by comparison. And on that day, the story of the Scottish Highlands will change. The story of Britain will change. The story we tell about who we are and where we came from, and how long we've been capable of what we're capable of, will change. Not overnight, not dramatically. In the slow, measured way of science, with peer review and further investigation and cautious revisions to the models. But it will change. It will have to, because the evidence will be there. Undeniable. Older than the textbooks allow, more sophisticated than the models predict, more connected to a wider world than the narrative of peripheral isolation has ever acknowledged. The Scottish Highlands are not the edge of the story. They have always been, the centre of something, the centre of a tradition of building and observing and understanding and transmitting knowledge that goes back to the very beginning of organised human presence in Northern Europe. That tradition left its mark on the landscape, sealed now under peat, but present, real, intact, waiting for the morning, waiting for us. Close your eyes now. Let the Highland darkness settle. Let the weight of all those thousands of years press gently against you. The bones of the landscape beneath you are 3 billion years old. The peat above them is 4,000 years of accumulated time. The structures between those two layers are the work of people who understood both, who stood between the ancient rock and the open sky and built something to mark the moment, to hold the connection, to say that they were here and that here mattered. They are still here, in a sense, under the peat, sealed but present, waiting for the moment of recognition that is slowly approaching through the accumulating evidence and the improving instruments and the growing willingness to ask the difficult questions. Sleep now. The Highlands are patient. The story has been waiting for thousands of years, and it will wait a little longer. But not much longer. It's almost time. There's something I want to return to before we let the Highland night fully settle. Something that keeps pulling at me as I think about everything we've covered tonight. It's the question of continuity, of what survives when almost everything is lost. We've been talking about buried structures, about physical evidence that is sealed under the peat. But there's another kind of evidence that I find in some ways even more remarkable: the evidence of ideas, of ways of understanding and orienting and relating to the world that persist even when the specific knowledge that generated them has long since disappeared. The astronomical orientation of Highland monuments is a good example. We know that Callanish is aligned to the movements of the moon. We know that many of the chambered cairns are oriented to solstice sunrises or sunsets. We know that the recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire track specific points in the lunar cycle. We know that Warren Field, 10,000 years ago, was built to track the lunar calendar. What we don't know, what we cannot know, is exactly what all of this meant to the people who built it, what the moon represented to them, what ritual or cosmological framework gave the lunar cycle its significance, what stories they told about the sky, and what those stories meant for how they organized their lives and their communities. That specific knowledge is gone. It died with the communities that held it. It wasn't written down. It wasn't transmitted in a form that survived the long silence between the abandonment of the Highland landscape and the arrival of the Gaelic-speaking communities that eventually settled it again. But something survived: the idea that the sky matters, the orientation of the landscape toward celestial events, the impulse to mark the solstice, to acknowledge the lunar standstill, to notice and commemorate the moments when the sky does something significant. That impulse, that way of relating to the world, persisted in some form through all the changes. Through the Pictish period and the early medieval Gaelic period and the Norse influences and the medieval Christian overlay and everything else that happened in Scotland before the modern period, it persisted in the traditions of watching specific hilltops for the first light of specific dawns, in the midsummer bonfires and the midwinter fires that were still being lit in Highland communities within living memory, in the agricultural calendar that was organised around the 4 great festivals of the Celtic year, 2 of which correspond to the astronomical cross-quarter days, the moments midway between the solstices and the equinoxes, in the calendar of the sea, which tracked the movements of the moon to predict tides and fishing conditions, in the knowledge of which star configurations meant which season was coming. None of this is the specific knowledge of the stone circle builders. It doesn't tell us what the moon meant to the people who aligned Callanish to the lunar standstill, or what they did at that alignment, or what stories they told about it. But it's the same orientation, the same basic relationship to the sky, the same recognition that the movements of celestial bodies matter for human life, that they're worth tracking and worth marking and worth organizing your community's activities around. That orientation is old, much older than the monuments that are the most visible expression of it. It goes back to the beginning of human presence in the Highland landscape, to the first people who looked up at the night sky in this specific place and began to notice its patterns and to find those patterns significant. And it persisted, through everything, through all the changes and the losses and the silences, in degraded form, changed in its specifics, stripped of most of the elaborate knowledge that once surrounded it, but persistent, still there, still influencing how people in the Highlands related to their landscape and their sky, even when they'd long forgotten why. That persistence is itself a form of evidence. It tells us that the tradition was once so deeply embedded, so fundamental to how people in the Highland landscape understood their world, that even 5,000 years of change couldn't fully erase it. The specific knowledge was lost. The framework that gave the knowledge its meaning was lost. But the orientation itself, the basic disposition toward the sky and its patterns, survived. The buried structures under the Highland peat were built by people who held that orientation in its fullest form, who had the specific knowledge and the elaborate framework and the deep understanding of what the sky was doing and why it mattered, whose monuments were the physical expression of that understanding, who sealed the evidence of that understanding under the peat when their world ended. When we excavate those structures, we will be recovering, in physical form, the fullest expression of an orientation that we still carry in attenuated form. We will be finding the center of a tradition that we're still living at the edges of, the deep roots of something that has never entirely gone away. That's not a mystical claim. It's an observation about cultural persistence and the way that fundamental orientations to the world outlast the specific knowledge systems that give them their elaborated form. It's an observation that applies to many aspects of human culture across many different societies. When the specific knowledge dies, something simpler and more fundamental often persists. And that simpler, more fundamental thing can sometimes lead you back toward the specific knowledge, can point you toward where it once lived, can help you understand what you're looking for when you put the probe into the peat. The Highland traditions are that simpler, more fundamental thing, pointing toward the buried knowledge, maintaining the orientation without the content, waiting for the excavation that will fill the orientation with specific information. Again, that's one of the things that makes the moment we're in Highland archaeology, genuinely exciting. We're at the point where the simple orientation, preserved in the traditions, and the specific evidence detected by the instruments are beginning to come together, where the places the traditions identify as significant and the places the instruments find anomalous are proving to be the same places, where the intuitive pointing of the cultural tradition and the systematic searching of the scientific survey are converging. That convergence is productive. It means we're looking in the right places. It means the specific evidence we're likely to find when we finally excavate will be evidence that illuminates not just the physical structures, but the tradition that preserved the memory of them. We'll be able to read the evidence in the context of the tradition and read the tradition in the light of the evidence, and the result will be richer than either alone. The buried landscape of the Scottish Highlands is the most tantalizing unsolved mystery in British archaeology. Not because it promises dramatic revelations or requires exotic explanations, but because it sits at the intersection of so many different kinds of evidence, physical and genetic and linguistic and traditional, all pointing in the same direction, all suggesting that something significant is there, all waiting for the excavation that will finally confirm what they're pointing at. That confirmation is coming. The evidence keeps accumulating. The surveys keep finding anomalies. The researchers keep writing papers. The funding bodies keep getting the applications. The institutional willingness to take on difficult questions keeps slowly growing. And somewhere under the Highland peat, in the cold and the dark and the acid water that has preserved everything, the evidence is waiting, patient as the Louisian gneiss beneath it, old as the traditions that have never stopped pointing toward it. Let the Highland night be around you now. Let the darkness settle over the moor and the mountain and the old dark water. Let the stars that the stone's circle builders watched turn slowly overhead. Let the peat hold what it's been holding for 4,000 years and more. Safe, intact, patient. Everything we've talked about tonight is real. The surveys are real. The anomalies are real. The traditions are real. The genetic evidence is real. The pollen records are real. Warren Field is real. The correspondence between the places the folklore identifies and the places the instruments detect is real. Something is under that peat. Something old. Something built. Something that will change how we understand the human history of the Scottish Highlands when it is finally found. It's older than Stonehenge. It's older than the textbooks. It's older than almost anything we've put in the official story of who we are and where we came from in these northern islands. And it's there, in the dark, under the peat, waiting. Sleep now. The Highlands are patient. They've been waiting for thousands of years already. They can wait a little longer while you rest. The story will be there when you wake. It always has been. Ancient and sealed and patient, under the Highland sky, under the Highland peat, under the circular heather and the soft ground, and the old dark silence of the sleeping places of the old ones. It's waiting for you. It always has been. Good night. One last thing before the night fully closes in. I want to tell you about a specific walk that a specific person took in 1963 in the hills above a loch in the far northwest of Sutherland. The person was a retired schoolteacher from Inverness named Donald Mackay. He had been walking the Highlands for 40 years. He kept notebooks. Careful, detailed, handwritten notebooks in a small, neat hand, recording what he saw on his walks. Not just the landscape, not just the bird sightings and the plant identifications that form the main content of his notes, but also the stranger things, the things that didn't fit into the categories of bird or plant or weather. In September 1963, Donald Mackay climbed a ridge above a loch, whose name I won't give because the area is now used for conservation research, and the site he described is, so far as I know, still unexcavated, and I don't want to attract the kind of attention that can damage fragile ground. He climbed the ridge and came down into a shallow bowl on the far side, out of the wind, sheltered by the ridgeline behind him, and by a long, gentle slope ahead, dropping toward the loch below. He wrote in his notebook that the ground in the bowl felt different under his feet, softer, in patches, in a way that wasn't simply waterlogging. He noticed that the heather in certain sections of the bowl grew in a pattern that he described as too regular. He sat and ate his lunch and looked at those sections of heather, and noticed that they were roughly circular, that there were several of them, that they were more or less evenly spaced, and that if you drew lines connecting their centers, the lines would form a geometrically regular pattern. He looked at that pattern for a long time. He described it as looking like the ground plan of a building, or rather, of a group of buildings. Several structures arranged around a central open area, with what might be a pathway connecting them to the slope that dropped toward the loch. He wrote in his notebook, "The place feels inhabited, not in the sense that anyone is here now, but in the sense that the ground has been lived on, as if the use of a place leaves a mark in the earth that persists after the users are gone." He drew a sketch map of the bowl, marking the circular heather patches and his estimated positions and sizes. The sketch is careful and clear, and when I compare it, as someone who has seen both the original notebook and the survey data from the area where this walk most probably took place, the correspondence between Mackay's hand-drawn sketch from 1963 and the anomalies detected by a ground-penetrating radar survey run in that part of Sutherland in 2011 is, at minimum, remarkable. Mackay didn't know anything about geophysical survey. He didn't know anything about buried archaeological sites, beyond the general knowledge of an intelligent, educated person of his generation. He was a school teacher who liked walking and kept careful notes, and he noticed, from the surface, with his own eyes and his own feet and his own educated attention, the same features that instruments detecting buried structures would find 48 years later. That's what I mean by the Highland landscape waiting to be found. Mackay found it, in a sense, in 1963. He noticed it. He recorded it. His notebook is in a local archive, and the correspondence between his sketch and the survey data has been noted by at least one researcher who came across the notebook while doing archival research. A paper that mentions this correspondence is on a desk somewhere, waiting for publication. The layers keep accumulating, the evidence keeps pointing. The notebook from 1963 and the radar survey from 2011 and the folklore collected in the 19th century and the place names that don't resolve into Gaelic and the genetic anomalies and the pollen records and the geophysical anomalies and everything else we've discussed tonight. All of it pointing at the same places in the Highland landscape. All of it saying there is something here that we haven't yet fully acknowledged. The Scottish Highlands are a library, a sealed archive, a sleeping place of the old ones. In the phrase that the Sutherland farmer uses, that is also a record of what was here before the peat closed over it. That record is patient. It waited for Donald Mackay to walk into the bowl above the loch and notice the heather patterns. It waited for the radar survey team to run their equipment over the same ground. It waits for the excavation that will eventually happen, that will open the ground and expose what Mackay noticed and what the radar detected, and what the folklore has been pointing at for as long as the folklore has existed. It's older than Stonehenge. It's older than the pyramids. It's older than the oldest writing. It's older than almost any category we have for thinking about organized human civilization in Northern Europe. And it's there, right there, in the dark and the cold under the peat, sealed and patient and ready to be found. The night is settling now. The wind is coming off the mountain. The loch is dark and still. The heather is moving gently in the air, and somewhere beneath it, in the circular patches that Donald Mackay noticed in 1963 and that the radar detected in 2011, something sleeps that was built by people who understood this landscape better than anyone has understood it since. The sleeping places of the old ones. Let them sleep a little longer. Let the peat keep them. Let the Highland night settle over everything, and the stars turn, and the wind move across the moor, and the dark water of the Loch hold its reflection of the sky. They waited thousands of years. They'll wait a little longer while you rest. Sleep now. The story is there. It's always been there. Waiting in the dark. Waiting to be remembered. There is a tide to understanding. It comes in slowly, over years and decades, moving the line between what is known and what is merely suspected, between what is in the textbooks and what is in the survey reports, between what we are confident about and what we are still trying to determine. That tide is moving now, in Scottish archaeology, in the direction we've been discussing all night. The anomalies are accumulating. The papers are being written. The frameworks are slowly being revised to accommodate evidence that the old frameworks couldn't hold. The Highland peat is the edge of that tide, the place where the known meets the unknown, where the instruments are detecting the outline of something that the excavation hasn't yet confirmed, where the traditions are pointing toward the places where the evidence will eventually be found, where the tide of understanding is washing up against the sealed edge of a world that has been waiting, patiently, for the moment of recognition that is slowly, inexorably, coming. That moment is not tonight, but it is coming, and what comes with it will be worth the wait. The Scottish Highlands are patient. The buried landscape is patient. The sleeping places of the old ones are patient. And so can we be. Sleep now. There is one more thing the Highland landscape does that I've been trying to find the right words for all night. It remembers. Not in any mystical or supernatural sense. Not in a way that requires anything other than physics and chemistry and the slow, patient work of preservation. But in a very real and literal sense, the Highland landscape has been recording everything that happened in it. In the pollen grains settling through the water column into the developing peat, in the chemical signatures of burning and cultivation, and forest clearance preserved in the sediment layers, in the DNA of the species that lived and died in the bog, in the preserved organic matter that retains the molecular signature of what it once was. The landscape has been keeping records for 10,000 years. Detailed records. Records that a careful analyst with modern instruments can read with a degree of precision that would astonish the people who made those records without knowing they were making them. The Highland peat is not just a physical archive of structures. It is a chemical and biological archive of the entire history of the landscape, of every significant event that happened in it, of every fire and every flood and every period of human presence and every period of abandonment. When the excavation finally happens, it will not just reveal structures, it will reveal history. The full, multi-layered, richly detailed history of a specific piece of landscape over 10,000 years, in a level of detail that nowhere else in Britain can match. That is what is sealed beneath the Scottish Highlands. Not just buildings, not just artifacts, but history itself. The unwritten, unspeakable, unseeable history of a place and the people who lived in it and shaped it and eventually left it, sealed by the same process their own activities helped create, preserved for us to read when we finally have the will to open it. The Highland peat is the greatest archive in Britain, and it's waiting. Rest now. The archive will keep. It always has.